I kept my $46,000 monthly salary a complete secret from my fiancé. He thought I was just a simple, innocent girl struggling to make ends meet. So when he invited me to an exclusive dinner with his parents, I played the role of the poor girlfriend perfectly. But the moment I stepped through their front door, I stumbled upon a sickening secret that changed absolutely everything. Here is $50. Take these coats to the guest bedroom, and please do not make eye contact with the investors. Beatrice, the woman who was supposed to be my future mother-in-law, shoved a crumpled wad of cash and a heavy pile of cashmere coats into my chest before I even had both feet inside the foyer. The freezing wind was still biting at my back as the heavy oak door shut behind me, sealing me inside a massive luxury estate where I was clearly not viewed as a guest. My name is Naomi, and I am 35 years old. If you have ever had the people who were supposed to be your family look right through you, hit subscribe and like this video, because what I did next tore this fake arrogant dynasty down to the studs. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. For 2 entire years, my fiancé Jamal believed I was a struggling freelance virtual assistant. It was a highly convenient cover. The absolute truth was that I was the founder and chief executive officer of a wildly lucrative data analytics firm. I preferred stealth wealth. I drove an older, reliable sedan, wore unbranded clothing, and lived a very quiet life. I wanted a man who loved me for my heart and my mind, not for my corporate bank accounts or my extensive stock portfolio. Jamal seemed to be exactly that kind of man. He was charming, ambitious, and always told me how much he adored my simple, uncomplicated nature. But standing in his parents' lavish marble foyer, buried under the heavy weight of strangers' coats, that beautiful illusion began to violently crack. I looked around the grand chandelier-lit hallway for Jamal. The massive house was already buzzing with wealthy elites, the clinking of expensive crystal glasses, and the low hum of arrogant laughter. Surely Jamal would step forward, take the heavy coats from my tired hands, and introduce me proudly to his mother. Surely he would correct this humiliating mistake. But when I finally spotted him standing near the grand sweeping staircase, he did not look proud. He looked entirely panicked. Before I could even open my mouth to speak his name, he lunged forward, grabbed my wrist tightly, and yanked me out of the bright hallway. He pulled me forcefully into a dark, cramped walk-in pantry, shutting the heavy wooden door behind us and instantly cutting off the lively sounds of the wealthy party outside. "What are you doing?" I asked, dropping the heavy cashmere coats onto a large sack of imported flour. Jamal ran a shaking hand over his perfectly lined-up haircut, pacing in the narrow space between the shelves of expensive truffles and aged wine. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not apologize for his mother's incredibly degrading behavior. Instead, he reached into his tailored suit pocket and pulled out a cheap black catering apron. He shoved it toward me with trembling hands. "Naomi, you have to help me out here," he pleaded, though his dark eyes were cold and intensely calculating. "My parents are hosting the most important networking event of the entire year tonight. The biggest angel investors in the city are standing right out there in the living room. I cannot have them knowing my fiancé is just a virtual assistant who barely makes minimum wage. It is an absolute embarrassment to my brand." I stared at the black fabric dangling from his hands, feeling my chest tighten with a sharp, profound sense of betrayal. "Embarrassing," I repeated, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. "You told me this was an intimate family dinner to celebrate our engagement. You told me your parents wanted to formally welcome me into the fold." Jamal sighed loudly, rolling his eyes toward the ceiling, as if I were a foolish child, failing to grasp a very basic concept. "Naomi, you know how hard it is for me to live up to my family legacy. You are a simple girl. You do not understand high finance or how these high society events actually work. It is all about image and leverage. If my investors find out I am marrying someone with absolutely no assets, no connections, and no real career, they will think I have remarkably poor judgment. They will pull their funding for my new tech startup." He stepped closer, attempting to use the smooth, charming tone that had successfully worked on me for 2 years. Just play the role of the help tonight. Just for tonight, I promise. Put on the apron, pour the champagne, and stay out of sight. You are so good at serving others, baby. Please do it for us. Do it for our future together. The absolute audacity of his request echoed loudly in the small, dimly lit pantry. He actually wanted me to act as a silent servant at my own engagement celebration because my fake poverty was too humiliating for his incredibly fragile ego. He thought I was hopelessly naive. He truly believed my stunned silence was simply blind compliance. He had absolutely no idea that my highly trained analytical mind was already rapidly dissecting every single word, every tiny micro-expression on his sweating face. His desperation felt entirely unnatural. It was way too intense just for a simple networking event. Something else was happening here. Something dark and buried beneath the thick layers of his elitist panic. I looked down at the crumpled $50 bill his mother had practically thrown at me, and then at the black apron still dangling from his tense fingers. I did not cry. I did not throw a dramatic tantrum or raise my voice. I simply reached out, took the apron from his hands, and smiled, a remarkably sweet, completely empty smile. "Of course, Jamal," I said softly. "Anything for our future." He let out a massive, heavy sigh of relief, quickly kissing my forehead, before slipping back out into the bright party, completely unaware that he had just handed a loaded weapon to a woman who routinely negotiated multi-million-dollar corporate mergers before her morning coffee. I secured the thin black strings of the apron tightly behind my waist. The rough, cheap fabric scratched against my expensive silk blouse, creating a sharp and constant physical reminder of the absurd situation I was in. It was a stark contrast to the luxurious, highly successful life I had secretly built for myself over the past decade. I took a deep, steadying breath, carefully smoothing my expression into a flawless mask of polite submission. I pushed open the heavy pantry door and stepped out of the shadows, walking right back into the blinding light of the grand living room. I found the temporary catering station set up near the kitchen entrance. I picked up a heavy silver tray loaded with crystal champagne flutes and began my performance. I stepped onto the plush carpets and weaved through the sea of tailored suits and designer gowns. It was a fascinating, almost comical sociological experiment. Nobody looked at my face. Not a single person offered a polite nod or a simple thank you. To them, the black apron rendered me entirely invisible. I was the chief executive officer of Apex Analytics. I commanded a team of 50 elite data scientists. I routinely sat across the table from ruthless billionaires and negotiated massive corporate buyouts. Yet in this room, simply because I held a serving tray and wore a uniform, I was reduced to a piece of unimportant furniture. I navigated around a group of loud businessmen and spotted Beatrice standing near the massive marble fireplace. She was holding court surrounded by 3 older women, dripping in diamond jewelry that looked suspiciously cloudy under the harsh chandelier light. Beatrice was wearing an emerald green dress that I immediately recognized as a 3-year-old design from a discount luxury outlet. I approached their tight circle, quietly, expertly balancing the heavy tray on one hand, ready to offer them fresh drinks. As I stepped closer, Beatrice caught my eye. She did not stop talking. She did not politely wait for me to pass. Instead, she deliberately raised her voice, ensuring I would hear every single syllable of her conversation. She was using me as a prop to elevate her own status in front of her snobby friends. "Look at her," Beatrice sneered, gesturing toward me with her empty glass as if I were a tragic charity case on display. "Jamal has such a savior complex, it is honestly exhausting for our family to watch." One of the women, a tall lady with far too much facial filler, let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Where did he even find this one, Beatrice?" she asked, looking right through me as I carefully handed her a fresh flute of chilled champagne. Beatrice sighed dramatically, adjusting her imitation pearl necklace with a dramatic flourish. "Oh, he found her in some tiny apartment on the wrong side of town. She is a freelance virtual assistant. She types emails for people or does data entry or something equally trivial. She does not understand high finance or investment portfolios like our family does. You know how it is, ladies. These uneducated girls see a successful, wealthy man, and they latch on like desperate parasites. Jamal is just too kind-hearted to cut her loose. He pities her, really. The women chuckled in unison, sipping their expensive champagne. They waited for me to shrink away in shame. They clearly wanted me to flush with embarrassment, to drop my gaze, and to scurry back to the kitchen like a beaten dog. They thrived on making others feel incredibly small. But I did not give them the satisfaction. I did not flinch. I stood there perfectly still, maintaining a serene, incredibly polite smile on my face. I poured another glass for Beatrice, my hand perfectly steady, not a single drop spilling onto the expensive Persian rug beneath our feet. As I watched the golden bubbles rise in her crystal glass, my analytical mind instantly ran the numbers. I knew exactly what her husband's investment firm was currently worth. I had run the market data myself just last quarter, when one of my clients considered acquiring their assets. I knew their stock portfolio was heavily leveraged and bleeding capital. I knew they were drowning in hidden debt, desperately trying to keep up appearances. I smiled sweetly at Beatrice, nodding my head in a gesture of fake subservience. In my head, I was laughing uncontrollably. My personal take-home pay was $46,000 a month. That was pure liquid cash, not tied up in failing stocks or risky fake startup ventures. I made more money in 4 weeks than Beatrice and her arrogant husband had yielded in the past 12 months combined. She was standing there mocking my tiny apartment, completely unaware that I actually owned the entire luxury high-rise building where that apartment was located. I chose to live in a smaller unit because I valued simplicity and peace, not because I could not afford better. True wealth whispers, but fake wealth is always screaming for attention. "Enjoy the champagne, ladies," I said, in a soft, completely unbothered voice. I turned around and walked away, feeling a sudden, intense rush of power. Their vicious insults did not sting me anymore. They were simply pathetic. I continued circulating through the massive room, offering drinks and seamlessly collecting empty glasses. I watched Jamal across the room, schmoozing with potential investors. He was laughing loudly, slapping men on the back, playing the role of the wealthy tech visionary to absolute perfection. He looked so confident, so entirely sure that his web of lies was holding strong. After an hour of serving, the champagne bottles at the main station were running dangerously low. I needed to grab the reserve boxes from the hallway closet to keep the party flowing. I slipped out of the crowded, noisy living room and walked down the quiet, dimly lit corridor toward the back of the house. The loud jazz music faded into a low, distant thump. As I approached the heavy oak doors of the private family study, I heard a sharp, panicked whisper cutting through the silence. It was Jamal, and he was not alone. I stopped dead in my tracks. The heavy oak door of the study was cracked open just a few inches, casting a thin slice of yellow light across the dark hallway floor. I pressed my back against the cool wall, holding the empty silver tray tightly against my chest to stop my hands from shaking. The second voice belonged to his younger sister, Kendra. She sounded entirely unhinged, her breath catching in frantic, ragged gasps. "I am going to prison, Jamal." Kendra cried out, her voice muffled but distinct. "The corporate auditing team is coming in on Monday. They already flagged the offshore transfers. $200,000 is missing from the company accounts. If I do not put that embezzled money back into the corporate ledger by Friday morning, they are calling the federal authorities. My life is completely over." I heard the distinct sound of Jamal pacing across the hardwood floor. His footsteps were heavy and deliberate, projecting a false sense of control. "Keep your voice down," Jamal hissed sharply. "You are not going to prison, Kendra. I told you I had it handled, did I not? You just need to hold it together for 12 more hours. 12 hours, Kendra laughed bitterly. How are you going to magically produce $200,000 in 12 hours? Your fake tech startup is bleeding cash. Dad is dodging creditors left and right. Mom is wearing cubic zirconia and pretending it is real diamonds. We are entirely broke, Jamal." I closed my eyes. The puzzle pieces were rapidly snapping into place. My analytical brain, the same brain that built a multi-million-dollar enterprise from absolute scratch, was working at lightning speed. The fake wealth. The desperation for angel investor money. The insistence that I wear a catering apron to hide my supposed poverty. It was all a carefully constructed house of cards. But Jamal was not finished speaking, and his next words made my blood freeze completely solid in my veins. "I do not need to produce the money," Jamal said smoothly, his voice dripping with a sickening level of arrogant confidence. "Naomi is producing it for us." My breath caught in my throat. I pressed my ear closer to the narrow crack in the door. "What are you talking about?" Kendra asked, her panic momentarily replaced by total confusion. "She is a freelance virtual assistant. Mom said she lives in a tiny apartment and shops at discount stores. She does not have 2 dimes to rub together." Jamal let out a low, cruel chuckle that made my stomach turn. "That is exactly what I want everyone to think. But her credit score is absolutely flawless, Kendra. I saw her mail once. Not a single late payment. Zero debt. Perfect financial history. She is incredibly naive and trusts me completely." So this morning, while she was making breakfast, I handed her a massive stack of legal documents. I told her it was the joint lease agreement for that luxury penthouse downtown. I told her I needed her signature immediately so we would not lose the deposit. I felt a sudden violent wave of nausea wash over me. I vividly remembered that morning. Jamal had kissed my neck, handed me a pen, and pointed to the little yellow sticky notes indicating exactly where I needed to sign. I was so busy reviewing a highly confidential quarterly earnings report on my laptop that I just blindly signed where he told me to, trusting the man I had agreed to marry. "You made her sign a lease?" Kendra asked. "How does that help me?" "It was not a lease, you idiot," Jamal snapped. "It was a high-interest personal loan application. With her perfect credit history, she easily qualified as the sole guarantor for $250,000. She signed everything without reading a single page. She practically handed us a blank check. The bank approved the application an hour ago. The funds are being wired directly into my personal account first thing tomorrow morning." The silence in the study was deafening. Even Kendra seemed stunned by the sheer magnitude of his betrayal. "So you are just going to steal her credit?" Kendra whispered. "What happens when the bank comes after her for the money?" "Not my problem," Jamal replied coldly. "Once the funds clear tomorrow, I will transfer your $200,000 to cover your little embezzlement mistake so you do not go to federal prison. I will keep the remaining $50,000 as my cut for saving your pathetic life. And then I pack my bags, block her number, and drop her completely. Let her spend the next 20 years working double shifts as a virtual assistant to pay off the massive debt. She is just dead weight anyway." I stood completely frozen in the dark hallway. 2 entire years. Every sweet kiss, every anniversary dinner, every whispered promise about our future family together. It was all a highly calculated financial hit job. He had targeted me specifically because I lived simply assuming my lack of luxury goods meant I was easily manipulated. He thought I was just a clueless, pathetic girl who would quietly absorb the total destruction of her life. I slowly lowered the silver tray to the carpeted floor, making absolutely no sound. I did not burst into the room weeping. I did not scream or demand an emotional explanation. People who operate on raw emotion make careless mistakes, and I do not make mistakes. I raised my left wrist. The screen of my Apple Watch illuminated in the dim light. With one calm, deliberate tap of my finger, I opened the voice memo application. A small red circle appeared on the bright screen, indicating that it was securely recording every single word echoing from the study. I took a deep, silent breath, letting the cold reality of the situation harden my heart into solid stone. Jamal wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial ruin. He just had absolutely no idea he was playing against the house. I ended the voice recording with a firm tap of my finger. I pulled the long sleeve of my cheap black blouse down to completely conceal my Apple Watch, hiding the digital weapon I had just armed. Without making a single sound, I backed away from the heavy oak door of the study. I left my silver serving tray resting on the carpet and walked briskly down the dim hallway, heading straight for the massive industrial kitchen at the back of the house. The kitchen was a chaotic flurry of intense activity. Hired chefs were shouting orders over the loud hissing of hot pans, and catering staff were rushing past me, carrying massive platters of expensive seafood. It was loud, hot, and perfectly distracting. Nobody paid any attention to the quiet woman in the black apron standing by the stainless steel refrigerators. I leaned my back against the cool metal surface and closed my eyes for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds. That was the exact amount of time I allowed myself to mourn the illusion of Jamal. I mourned the fake future we had planned, the fake smiles he had given me, and the fake love he had used to blind me. When I opened my eyes on the 4th second, the naive girlfriend was entirely dead. The grief evaporated instantly, replaced by the cold, calculating mindset of a chief executive officer facing a hostile threat. Jamal thought he was playing a game of checkers with a clueless pawn. He did not realize I had already flipped the entire board. I reached deep into the pocket of my apron and pulled out my personal cell phone. I bypassed my standard contacts and opened a highly encrypted private messaging application. I quickly typed a message to Harrison, the ruthless lead corporate attorney who handled all the high-stakes legal affairs for my data analytics firm. Harrison was brilliant, aggressively protective of my assets, and completely merciless when dealing with corporate fraud. Harrison, I need your immediate assistance. I typed rapidly, my thumbs flying across the glass screen. I am currently dealing with a severe case of financial sabotage. A high-interest personal loan application for $250,000 was submitted in my name this morning. The guarantor's signature was obtained through deliberate deception and active fraud. Less than 15 seconds later, my screen illuminated with Harrison's reply. He was always on call for me. Understood, Naomi. I am pulling up your financial monitoring dashboard right now. I see the pending application. The funds are scheduled to be wired into a private account under the name Jamal Watkins at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I will immediately initiate a hard cancellation, freeze all associated credit bureaus, and draft a cease and desist order. No, I typed back immediately, my heart beating with a steady, fierce rhythm. Do not cancel the loan application, Harrison. I repeat, do not cancel it. There was a brief pause. I could almost picture my highly paid lawyer sitting in his downtown office staring at his screen in total confusion. When he replied, his message was cautious. Naomi, if I do not cancel this application tonight, the funds will legally bind to your credit profile. You are exposing yourself to massive liability. Explain your strategy. I smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile. Harrison, if we simply cancel the loan, Jamal will just invent another lie. He will claim it was a banking error or a misunderstanding. He will try to gaslight his way out of it and slither away quietly. I do not want him to slither away. I want to crush him completely, and I want it entirely on the public record. I continued typing out my precise instructions. Contact the Executive Fraud Division at the bank directly. Use my premier client status to bypass the standard queues. I want you to officially flag this specific transaction as an active felony in progress. Do not stop the internal processing, but place a hard federal lock on the receiving account. I want the system to trigger a critical Level 1 fraud alert. I knew exactly how banking infrastructure operated. My company literally built the predictive algorithms that these financial institutions use to track money laundering and identity theft. By flagging the transaction as an active felony, rather than just canceling it, the bank would be legally obligated to freeze Jamal's entire financial portfolio. They would lock his checking accounts, his savings accounts, and his business accounts. Furthermore, the automated system would immediately dispatch a severe security warning to the secondary contacts on the file. Kendra would get an alert right to her phone. I wanted them to think they had won. I wanted Kendra to hold her breath waiting for that glorious approval notification to pop up on her screen. And then, surrounded by all these wealthy elitists and potential investors, I wanted them to feel the brutal, suffocating panic when the federal fraud trap clamped firmly around their ankles. Harrison replied one final time. Strategy understood. It is brilliant and absolutely ruthless. I am connecting with the bank executives now. The trap is set, Naomi. The system will process the critical alert and dispatch the notifications in exactly 25 minutes. Give them hell. I locked my phone and slipped it safely back into my pocket. The digital snare was armed and ticking down. Jamal and Kendra had tried to build their fake empire by standing directly on my back, completely unaware that I had the power to shatter the ground beneath them with a single text message. I took a deep breath, letting the chaotic noise of the busy kitchen wash over me. I smoothed the wrinkles out of my cheap catering apron and adjusted the collar of my blouse. My face was a perfect mask of calm subservience. I picked up a fresh silver tray, loaded it with steaming hot crab cakes, and prepared to walk back into the lion's den. I was no longer just the hired help pouring drinks. I was the architect of their total destruction, patiently waiting for the timer to hit 0. I pushed the heavy swinging kitchen doors open, carefully, balancing the large silver tray of fresh steaming crab cakes on my right hand. The moment I stepped out into the dim hallway, the solid oak door of the study clicked shut. Kendra emerged from the shadows. Her posture was completely transformed from the panicked, hyperventilating woman I had secretly recorded just minutes ago. She rolled her shoulders back, lifted her chin high, and pasted a smug, arrogant smile onto her perfectly contoured face. She spotted me instantly in the hallway. Instead of looking guilty or ashamed, she looked incredibly empowered by the massive theft she was actively committing against me. She strutted right up to me, stopping so close I could smell the heavy alcohol on her breath. She raised her manicured hand and loudly snapped her fingers just inches from my face. "Make sure those crab cakes are actually hot, sweetheart," Kendra sneered, her dark eyes scanning my cheap black catering apron with absolute disgust. "Try not to mess this simple task up. Look around and take notes tonight. This is the absolute closest you will ever get to real wealth in your entire pathetic life." I looked directly into her eyes, refusing to break contact. I did not glare, I did not scowl, and I certainly did not cry. I gave her the exact same empty, perfectly polite smile I gave to difficult clients during hostile corporate takeovers. "I will be sure to serve them while they are steaming, Kendra," I replied, my voice completely smooth and unbothered. "Enjoy the rest of your evening." She scoffed, flipping her hair over her shoulder, and marched proudly toward the main living room, completely convinced she was the smartest person in the house. I took a slow, deep breath, letting her insults slide off me like water. I adjusted my grip on the heavy tray and followed her into the bright, crowded party. The volume of the conversations had doubled since I was last in the room. Wealthy guests were drinking heavily and laughing loudly, but my perspective had entirely shifted. Before I had seen a room full of intimidating high society elites. Now, looking through the sharp, unforgiving lens of a data analyst, I saw a rapidly decaying ecosystem. I saw the desperate, jagged cracks in the foundation of the Watkins family empire. I offered a warm crab cake to a wealthy-looking man in a bespoke tuxedo, then smoothly pivoted toward the far corner of the room where Jamal's father, Roland, was standing. Roland was completely isolated from the main group of powerful investors. He was furiously tapping the cracked screen of his cell phone, his face flushed a deep, unhealthy shade of crimson. As I glided silently past him, his phone began to vibrate violently in his hand. I glanced down at the illuminated screen. The caller identification displayed a corporate number I immediately recognized from my industry network. It was a notoriously aggressive private commercial debt collection agency. Roland frantically declined the call, his hands visibly shaking. He wiped a heavy bead of sweat from his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief and quickly forced a wide, fake smile as an investor walked past him. I analyzed his appearance with ruthless precision. At first glance, his dark suit looked expensive, but the fabric was shiny at the elbows from years of excessive dry cleaning. His leather shoes were meticulously polished, but the soles were completely worn down at the edges. Roland was not a confident titan of industry. He was a terrified, drowning man standing on the very edge of total bankruptcy, desperately trying to keep his head above water. I continued my rounds, my tray growing lighter, as the oblivious guests devoured the appetizers. I circled back toward the massive marble fireplace where Beatrice was still holding her ridiculous court. She was aggressively cornering the wife of a prominent venture capitalist, laughing far too loudly at a joke that was not even remotely funny. I stepped close enough to offer them cocktail napkins, my eyes carefully scanning Beatrice from head to toe. Earlier in the evening, I had been too distracted by her cruelty to notice the glaring discrepancies in her wardrobe. But now, with the truth ringing loudly in my ears, the financial red flags were everywhere. Her emerald green dress, which she proudly claimed to everyone was custom couture, had uneven bunched stitching along the back zipper. It was a high-tier counterfeit. The massive diamond tennis bracelet glittering aggressively on her wrist caught the chandelier light, but the refraction was completely wrong. Real diamonds fracture light into sharp grays and brilliant whites. Her bracelet was throwing off cheap, colorful rainbows. Kendra had been absolutely right in the study. It was cubic zirconia. The entire family was completely broke. They were drowning in a silent, suffocating ocean of debt, desperately clinging to each other to stay afloat. The luxurious estate we were standing in was likely mortgaged to the absolute legal limit. The fancy cars parked out in the circular driveway were undoubtedly leased, and probably months behind on payments. Jamal's upcoming tech startup was not a passionate entrepreneurial project. It was a frantic Hail Mary pass to secure enough angel investor capital to save his parents from foreclosure and his sister from federal prison. And I was their designated sacrificial lamb. Jamal had played the role of the loving savior, swooping into my intentionally simple life, pretending to love my lack of ambition and my cheap clothes. He thought my perfect credit score and spotless financial history were an untapped goldmine just waiting to be exploited. He assumed that because I did not wear designer labels or drive exotic sports cars, I would be too stupid to understand the complex legal documents he placed in front of me that morning. I watched Jamal from across the room. He was eagerly shaking hands with the wealthy older men he was actively trying to con. He looked so incredibly proud of himself. He thought he had executed the perfect financial scam. He truly believed that tomorrow morning he would wake up $250,000 richer, completely unburdened by the naive girlfriend who loved him. I checked the time on the massive grandfather clock standing against the far wall. The federal fraud trap my attorney had set was actively processing through the banking system. I felt a cold, deep satisfaction settle firmly into my bones. Let them laugh at me. Let them mock my cheap black apron and my tiny apartment. The higher they climbed on their unstable mountain of lies, the more bones they were going to break when I finally pushed them off the edge. I was standing near the edge of the dining room when Kendra snapped her fingers at me again. She pointed sharply toward the massive double doors leading into the grand hall. "Bring a fresh tray of champagne in there right now," she commanded, adjusting her tight dress to ensure the fake designer fabric sat perfectly on her hips. Jamal is about to pitch his revolutionary tech startup to the investors. He needs everyone perfectly lubricated so they open their checkbooks. Move quickly, we do not have all night. I gave her a curt nod and headed back to the kitchen to load up my silver tray. When I walked into the grand hall a few minutes later, the atmosphere had completely shifted. The casual networking party had transformed into a formal corporate briefing. Rows of plush velvet chairs were arranged facing a large projector screen. The wealthy guests were taking their seats holding their crystal glasses and looking expectantly toward the front of the room, where Jamal was confidently adjusting his lapel microphone. As I circulated through the back rows offering the fresh champagne, my eyes fell on the sleek glass tables positioned near the entrance. They were completely covered in thick, glossy presentation brochures. Jamal had spared absolutely no expense on the heavy cardstock printing. The cover featured a bold, modern logo for a fake company he called Quantum Logic. Underneath the logo was a tagline boasting about a revolutionary predictive algorithm for market fluctuations. I paused, balancing the heavy tray on my left hand, and carefully used my right hand to slide one of the brochures open. I stared at the glossy pages, my heart suddenly stopping in my chest. The breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. Printed in high-definition color on the heavy paper were the exact user interface mockups, the specific data visualization charts, and the highly complex predictive models that belonged entirely to my company. It was Apex Analytics. I looked closer, my eyes darting across the paragraphs of dense technical jargon. Jamal had not even bothered to change the specific labeling on the axis of the graphs. He had literally copied and pasted the proprietary diagnostic codes that my lead engineering team had spent the last 18 months developing behind tightly locked doors. This was not just a generic business idea he had cooked up in his spare time. This was the exact encrypted master file I kept secured on my home office laptop. My mind raced backward, scanning my memories for the exact moment of the security breach. It hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. 3 weeks ago, I had been working late in my home office on a highly sensitive client merger. Jamal had brought me a cup of hot peppermint tea. He stood behind my chair, massaging my shoulders, acting like the perfect supportive partner while watching my screen intently. He had seen me type my master encryption password. Later that week, I went out for a long morning run while he stayed in bed complaining of a headache. That was his window. He had hooked up an external drive to my machine, unlocked the secure partition, and stolen my entire life's work. The massive personal loan fraud suddenly looked like child's play. Stealing my perfect credit score to bail his sister out of an embezzlement charge was just the appetizer for this family. This was the main course. Jamal knew he possessed absolutely no technical skills. He was just a smooth talker with a handsome face and an empty brain. He needed a brilliant product to sell to these wealthy angel investors to save his drowning parents from bankruptcy. So he decided to simply steal the multi-million-dollar software platform built by the woman who trusted him, slap his own fake name on it, and sell it to the highest bidder in this room. The software detailed in this cheap pamphlet was currently valued at over $40 million. This was intellectual property that my clients, including some of the largest financial institutions in the country, trusted me to keep absolutely secure. By stealing these files and showing them to a room full of random rich people, Jamal was not just committing blatant theft. He was actively putting me at risk of massive federal corporate liability. I gently closed the glossy brochure and placed it back onto the glass table, making sure it was perfectly aligned with the others. The initial shock quickly dissolved into a blinding, white-hot rage, but I did not let a single ounce of that fury show on my face. I picked up my tray and continued walking silently through the rows of seated guests. I watched Jamal confidently walk up to the center of the room, beaming brightly under the projector light. He tapped his microphone, asking the wealthy audience for their undivided attention. He looked like a triumphant king ready to claim his throne. He was about to present my sheer genius as his own, completely unaware that the actual creator of that genius was standing right in the back row, holding a tray of drinks ready to execute a flawless corporate slaughter. The room fell completely silent as Jamal tapped the microphone clipped to his expensive tailored suit. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight, and the massive chandelier above had been dimmed to direct all attention to the glowing projector screen behind him. I stood perfectly still in the shadows at the back of the room, my fingers wrapped tightly around the edge of the heavy silver tray. I watched the man I had planned to marry step into the spotlight with absolute confidence. "Welcome, everyone," Jamal began, his voice projecting a smooth, practiced authority that commanded the room. "We live in an era of unprecedented market volatility. Traditional predictive models are fundamentally broken. They look backward to tell you where you have been. But you do not invest millions of dollars to look at the past. You invest to own the future." My jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached. That was my exact opening line. It was the precise phrasing I had used during my Q2 stakeholder address just 3 months ago. I had practiced that specific speech in our living room while he sat on the couch pretending to read a sports magazine. He had not been ignoring me. He had been taking mental notes. Jamal clicked the presentation remote in his hand. The massive screen flashed, displaying a complex, high-definition data visualization chart. He proudly introduced it as the quantum logic matrix. It was not a matrix. It was the Apex Analytics proprietary predictive funnel, a highly encrypted software model my team had spent thousands of hours meticulously coding. Look closely at this supply chain latency correlation, Jamal instructed the audience, pacing slowly across the front of the room like a seasoned tech visionary. He pointed a red laser at the center of the graph. The algorithm operates much like oceanic tides. It does not just react to the wave crashing on the shore. It measures the seismic shift happening miles beneath the surface, allowing you to move your capital before the market even feels the tremor. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. He was reciting my metaphors word for perfect word. But as I watched him gesture to the screen, my highly trained eyes caught the subtle, fatal flaws in his performance. He was pointing his laser at the wrong data clusters. He was talking about supply chain latency while hovering his pointer over the consumer sentiment index. He had completely memorized the script I had written, but he possessed absolutely no fundamental understanding of the mathematics displayed behind him. He was a hollow actor reading lines from a stolen play. But the audience did not know that. The room was filled with wealthy, older investors who relied heavily on confident presentations and flashy buzzwords. They were completely captivated. I watched a prominent venture capitalist sitting in the second row lean forward, adjusting his glasses and nodding in deep approval. Several other men were furiously jotting down notes on their leather-bound legal pads. Jamal was actively weaving a multi-million-dollar spell over them, and it was working flawlessly. I shifted my gaze to the front row. Beatrice was sitting dead center, completely bathed in the glow of the projector screen. She was literally beaming. Her posture was rigidly straight, her chin tilted upward in an expression of supreme arrogance. She turned to the wealthy woman sitting next to her and whispered something behind her hand, her eyes shining with absolute triumph. She was soaking up the reflected glory of her genius son, completely convinced that their family was about to secure the massive financial bailout they desperately needed. Near the side wall, leaning casually against a marble pillar, stood Kendra. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and she wore a sickeningly smug smile. She locked eyes with Jamal for a brief second, offering him a subtle nod of encouragement. To her, this stolen software presentation was her literal get-out-of-jail-free card. Once these investors wrote their massive seed capital checks, she could quietly replace the $200,000 she had embezzled from her corporate employer, and no one would ever know. Jamal clicked to the next slide. It was a page dedicated to alpha testing and case studies. He cleared his throat, projecting an air of humble success. Last quarter, we ran a closed beta test of the quantum logic algorithm on a major national logistics firm facing total bankruptcy. He lied smoothly. The software accurately predicted a catastrophic supply chain collapse 3 months before it occurred, saving the client $18 million in dead inventory and completely reversing their quarterly losses. My blood boiled in my veins. That logistics firm was a real company, and that $18 million save was a real victory. But it had absolutely nothing to do with Jamal. I had personally spearheaded that entire corporate turnaround. I had worked 80-hour weeks sleeping on a cot in my office to save thousands of innocent employees from losing their jobs. And here Jamal was standing in his lavish living room, casually claiming my exhausting labor as his own brilliant beta test. The sheer terrifying magnitude of his deception finally settled over me in its entirety. The fraudulent $250,000 personal loan he had tricked me into signing was just petty cash. It was a temporary bridge loan to keep his father out of bankruptcy and his sister out of federal prison until tonight. This presentation was the real score. He intended to raise millions of dollars in venture capital based entirely on my stolen intellectual property. He was going to launch a massive tech empire using my genius, while leaving me utterly destroyed, saddled with $250,000 in high-interest debt, and trapped in a life of financial ruin. Jamal concluded his opening statement to a round of enthusiastic applause. Beatrice stood up from her chair, clapping loudly, ensuring everyone in the room saw how proud she was of her visionary son. The investors were smiling, leaning back in their plush velvet chairs, clearly eager to start talking about equity and valuations. I stood in the dark at the back of the room, the heavy silver tray resting firmly in my hands. They thought they had pulled off the perfect heist. They thought I was just the clueless poor girlfriend pouring their drinks. But Jamal had made one fatal miscalculation. He had stolen the software, but he did not possess the brain that built it. The room was primed, the investors were hooked, the trap was fully set. I took a slow, deep breath, untied the strings of my cheap catering apron, and prepared to burn his fake empire completely to the ground. Jamal lowered his hands as the enthusiastic applause began to fade into an excited, energetic murmur. He offered the wealthy room a polished, practiced smile. It was the exact same charming, disarming smile that had successfully manipulated me for 2 entire years. He stepped out from behind the sleek acrylic podium, casually unbuttoning his tailored suit jacket with an air of absolute arrogance. He was completely drunk on his own fake success, basking in the adoration of billionaires who thought they were looking at the next great tech visionary. "Thank you, everyone," Jamal said, his voice echoing smoothly through the high ceiling of the grand hall. "I know we have covered a massive amount of highly technical ground tonight. Quantum logic is not just a software patch or a simple upgrade. It is a fundamental paradigm shift in how we approach market volatility. I am sure you are all eager to discuss the architecture, the integration process, and of course the initial valuation. I would love to open the floor to any questions you might have." A prominent venture capitalist, sitting in the second row, immediately leaned forward, adjusting his expensive wire-rimmed glasses. He held a leather-bound legal pad in his lap and opened his mouth to speak, likely preparing to ask a soft complimentary question about seed funding requirements or early equity splits. I did not give him the chance to speak a single word. I left the heavy silver tray resting firmly on a side table at the very back of the room. I let the thin strings of my black catering apron hang loose around my waist, but I did not take the apron off. I wanted them to see exactly who was tearing their fragile empire apart. I wanted the investors to witness the supposed hired help completely dismantle the man standing on the stage. I stepped out of the dark shadows and walked directly down the center aisle of the room. "I have a question," I said. My voice was not a shout, but it cut through the murmuring room like a freshly sharpened blade. I did not use the soft, compliant tone Jamal was accustomed to hearing from me in our apartment. I used my executive boardroom voice. It was a tone highly engineered over years of brutal corporate negotiations to demand absolute attention and project unquestionable authority. Instantly, 60 pairs of eyes snapped toward me. The wealthy investors turned in their plush velvet chairs, their faces registering immediate and profound confusion. They saw a woman dressed in a cheap black uniform, a woman they had completely ignored and treated like invisible furniture all night, suddenly marching down the center aisle like she owned the entire estate. In the front row, Beatrice visibly gasped. Her hand flew to her chest, her manicured fingers clutching her fake cubic zirconia necklace tightly. She looked around the room in sheer horror, her carefully constructed high society image shattering in real time as the catering staff interrupted her son's multi-million-dollar pitch. Beside her, Roland sat completely frozen, his eyes wide with rising panic as he looked from me to the wealthy men sitting around him. Near the side wall, Kendra pushed herself aggressively off the marble pillar. Her smug, confident smile vanished instantly, replaced by a furious scowl. She took a threatening step toward me, but she stopped abruptly when the venture capitalists began murmuring amongst themselves, clearly intrigued by the sudden bizarre disruption. Up at the front of the room, Jamal squinted past the harsh, blinding glare of the projector light. He could not fully see my face at first, but he immediately recognized my voice. I saw his posture stiffen drastically. He gripped the edge of the acrylic podium, his knuckles turning completely white against the clear plastic. "Naomi," he hissed, his voice dropping to a frantic, furious whisper that the lapel microphone barely caught. He quickly forced a strained, terrified laugh, desperately trying to play the situation off as a harmless joke for the confused crowd. "Excuse me, everyone. It seems our catering staff has taken a sudden, passionate interest in predictive market analytics." A few of the older men chuckled nervously at his terrible joke, but the atmosphere in the room remained incredibly tense. I did not stop walking. I stopped exactly 10 feet away from the podium, standing directly in the crosshairs of the projector beam. The bright light illuminated my face clearly for everyone to see. I looked directly into his panicked eyes. "My question is regarding the fundamental operational architecture of the quantum logic matrix," I stated clearly, my eyes locked dead onto Jamal. "Your presentation was certainly theatrical, Mr. Watkins. The analogies were very polished. However, you deliberately glossed over a critical, fatal flaw in the data funnel." Jamal swallowed hard. A thick bead of sweat formed at his hairline and slowly rolled down his temple, catching the bright stage light. He opened his mouth to shut me down, to loudly order security to remove me from the premises, but I did not give him a single millimeter of breathing room. I launched the technical strike with ruthless precision. "How exactly does your algorithm account for the predictive latency in Q3 margins?" I asked, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. "Specifically, when you are dealing with massive asynchronous supply chain data sets, there is an inherent delay in the ingestion pipeline. If you are utilizing the standard heuristic model you just displayed on slide 4, your data clustering will degrade by a minimum of 14% during high volatility market shifts." The grand hall went completely, terrifyingly silent. You could hear a pin drop on the thick carpet. The venture capitalist men who possessed deep technical knowledge and managed billions of dollars in highly complex assets stopped looking at me like I was a confused waitress. They sat up perfectly straight in their chairs, their eyes darting rapidly between me and the complex chart glowing on the screen. They instantly recognized that my question was not a random, ignorant interruption. It was a highly sophisticated, lethal interrogation of the core product. I took one step closer, twisting the knife deeper into his stolen presentation. Furthermore, I continued projecting my voice so the entire room could hear the trap snapping shut. "How are you mitigating that exact 14% degradation without fundamentally violating the core encryption protocols of the back-end servers? Because according to your own schematic, correcting that latency would require a complete bypass of the security firewall, exposing your client's entire financial portfolio to external breaches." I stopped speaking, crossed my arms over my chest, and simply stared at him, waiting for his answer. It was the ultimate, inescapable trap. If Jamal actually understood the software he was attempting to sell to these billionaires, he would know that the Q3 latency issue was actively mitigated by a proprietary secondary buffering protocol. It was a secret safeguard built directly into the code that my engineering team had spent 6 grueling months developing. But Jamal had only stolen the visual slides. He had absolutely no idea how the engine actually worked beneath the surface. He did not know what asynchronous datasets were, he did not understand heuristic models, and he had absolutely no concept of back-end encryption firewalls. He was completely, utterly trapped on stage naked in front of his potential investors. Jamal stared down at me, his eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked like a deer caught in the blinding headlights of a speeding freight train. His mouth opened and closed silently several times like a fish gasping for oxygen on dry land. The lapel microphone picked up his rapid, panicked breathing, amplifying his severe physical distress through the surround sound speakers for everyone to hear. "Well," Jamal stammered, his voice cracking violently under the immense pressure. "The latency. The latency issue is something we are currently—" He looked frantically toward the massive projector screen, desperately searching the complex graphs for a lifeline, for any technical buzzword he could throw out to save himself. But the numbers and charts on the screen were just a foreign language to him. He looked over at his mother. Beatrice was gripping the armrests of her chair so tightly her fingernails were digging into the expensive velvet. She could not help him. He looked over at Kendra, who was staring at him with a look of absolute sickening horror, finally realizing her corporate bailout was currently going up in spectacular flames. "We have a dedicated team." Jamal finally choked out his charming facade, completely dissolving into a puddle of pathetic desperation. "My engineering team handles the specific day-to-day data ingestion protocols. I focus primarily on the macro-level visionary aspects of the company. A visionary who does not understand the basic structural foundation of his own technology," I replied coldly, my voice dripping with absolute unapologetic contempt. "That is not a visionary, Mr. Watkins. That is a massive financial liability." The wealthy venture capitalist in the second row slowly lowered his pen onto his notepad. He narrowed his eyes, analyzing Jamal's sweating, stuttering, terrified performance with deep suspicion. The grand illusion of the brilliant tech founder was shattering right in front of their eyes, systematically dismantled by a woman wearing a cheap black apron. Jamal wiped the heavy sweat from his brow with the back of his trembling hand. He let out another forced, entirely unnatural laugh that sounded more like a dry cough. His charming mask had completely melted off under the intense heat of the projector light, leaving behind a terrified little boy caught in a massive, inescapable lie. He gripped the edges of the clear acrylic podium so tightly that his knuckles turned completely white, desperately trying to anchor himself as the room began to spin wildly out of his control. "Listen," Jamal said, his voice dropping an octave in a frantic attempt to regain his masculine authority. "These are highly granular engineering specifics. As I mentioned during the introduction, we have a phenomenal back-end technical team that handles the weeds. I am the big picture founder. I would be more than happy to schedule a private breakout session with you later, miss, so we can take this offline and let the real investors continue with the presentation." I did not move a single muscle. I did not blink. I stood perfectly still in the center aisle, my cheap black catering apron contrasting sharply against the sea of tailored designer suits surrounding me. "We are not taking anything offline, Mr. Watkins," I replied, my voice perfectly level, but carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of an executive who was used to giving absolute orders. "You are standing in front of 60 premier venture capitalists, asking for a massive seed round valuation. If you cannot explain the foundational data structuring of your own flagship product, you are not a visionary founder. You are a highly liability-prone salesman holding a stolen brochure." A collective gasp echoed through the room. Several wealthy guests shifted uncomfortably in their plush velvet chairs, the tension in the grand hall thickening until it felt hard to breathe. Jamal opened his mouth to order security to remove me, but before he could formulate a single word, the prominent venture capitalist sitting in the second row spoke up. "Let her speak." "Watkins," the older investor commanded, his deep voice rumbling with impatient authority. He tapped his expensive silver pen against his leather-bound notepad, his sharp eyes narrowing as he glared up at the stage. "I actually want to hear the answer to her question. And frankly, I want to hear her next question. She is the only person in this entire house making any real sense tonight." Jamal swallowed so hard I could physically see his throat convulse. He looked at the powerful investor, then looked back at me, his dark eyes silently begging me to stop. He was trapped. If he kicked me out now, the investors would know he was a fraud, hiding from basic technical scrutiny. If he let me stay, I would continue to publicly butcher him. He had absolutely no good options left. I had methodically boxed him into a corner of his own making, and I had absolutely no mercy left in my body to give him. "Since you prefer to avoid the latency issue," I continued, my voice ringing with absolute clarity against the high ceiling, "let us move directly to the neural network architecture. Your presentation boldly claims that quantum logic utilizes dynamic node weighting to predict sudden market fractures." I took another deliberate step forward, commanding the absolute center of the room. The wealthy investors were hanging onto my every word, completely captivated by the catering staff member delivering a masterclass in software engineering. But any competent data scientist knows that dynamic weighting requires a continuously feeding application programming interface, I stated firmly. If you are pulling your raw financial metrics from the specific legacy banking servers you proudly listed on slide 7, those servers are hard-coded to refresh their datasets only once every 24 hours. I paused for exactly 2 seconds, letting the severe technical reality sink into the minds of the financial experts sitting around me. "So, Mr. Watkins," I asked, my tone dripping with cold precision, "please explain to this room full of seasoned financial experts how your algorithm manages real-time dynamic node weighting using fractured 24-hour delayed datasets without triggering a cascading false positive loop. Because if it triggers a false positive loop during a localized market crash, your software will actively command your clients to sell off their most valuable assets at a massive loss. You will bankrupt them in a matter of seconds." The silence that followed my second question was absolute and crushing. The technical density of what I had just said hung in the air like a heavy iron vault door slamming shut. It was an incredibly complex data structuring problem. It was the exact problem my elite engineering team at Apex Analytics had spent 4 agonizing months trying to solve before we finally cracked the code last November. It was the crown jewel of the entire software platform, and I knew for an absolute undeniable fact that the complex mathematical solution was not printed anywhere on the glossy presentation slides Jamal had stolen from my home office. Jamal leaned heavily into the microphone, his breathing ragged and uneven. The blinding projector light seemed to magnify every single bead of sweat rolling down his panicked face. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked desperately toward the massive screen behind him, searching the complex graphs for a lifeline for any technical buzzword he could throw out to save his rapidly sinking ship. But the numbers and charts on the screen were just a foreign language to him. The application programming interfaces, Jamal finally started, his voice cracking so severely it sounded like a dying radio signal. He cleared his throat loudly, stalling for time. "The interfaces are highly customized by our team. We use a cloud-based synergy protocol. The nodes are weighted through a secure blockchain ledger system that allows for maximum synergy across the fractured data clusters." It was pure, unadulterated word salad. He was just violently grabbing popular tech buzzwords from the internet and throwing them against the wall, desperately praying that something would stick. He sounded like a high school student who had not read the assigned book, trying to bluff his way through an oral presentation. But he was not pitching to a group of gullible teenagers. He was pitching to ruthless billionaires who made their vast fortunes by sniffing out corporate fraud and protecting their capital from fast-talking con artists. The venture capitalist in the second row let out a loud, disgusted scoff. He slapped his leather-bound notepad closed with a sharp crack that echoed violently through the tense room. A blockchain ledger system for neural node weighting, the investor repeated, his tone dripping with heavy, unapologetic sarcasm. "That makes absolutely zero mathematical sense, Watkins. You just combined 3 entirely different technological frameworks into one incredibly stupid sentence to try and sound smart. You are feeding us complete garbage." The murmurs in the room instantly escalated into outright hostile chatter. Men in expensive tailored suits were turning to each other, shaking their heads in profound disgust. Several investors immediately pulled out their smartphones, clearly texting their legal partners to pull any potential funding and distance themselves from this disastrous event. The atmosphere shifted permanently from a highly anticipated tech startup reveal to the scene of a brutal public corporate execution. Jamal was watching his multi-million-dollar payday evaporate into thin air right before his very eyes, and he had absolutely no idea how to stop it. He looked like a man drowning in a shallow pool, frantically thrashing around, but achieving absolutely nothing but his own exhaustion. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly by my sides. I did not raise my voice or show any negative emotion. The most terrifying thing a person can face is an opponent who destroys them with complete, detached calmness. Jamal had spent 2 entire years treating me like a naive, simple-minded accessory. He had mocked my career. He had manipulated my trust. He had stolen my identity for a fraudulent loan to save his sister. And he had stolen my life's work for this pathetic charade. Now, the invisible girlfriend was the only person in the room holding all the power, and I was just getting started. The heavy silence in the room was suddenly shattered by the sharp, aggressive clicking of high heels striking the hardwood floor. Beatrice had finally snapped. She could no longer sit in the front row and watch her golden child be publicly humiliated by the woman she viewed as nothing more than hired help. She bolted out of her plush velvet chair, her face contorted into an ugly mask of pure, unfiltered rage. She marched directly down the center aisle toward me, her fake emerald dress swishing violently with every hurried step. Before I could even brace myself, Beatrice lunged forward and clamped her manicured hand tightly around my upper arm. Her acrylic nails dug painfully through the thin fabric of my cheap black catering blouse. "How dare you!" Beatrice hissed, her voice trembling with furious indignation. She turned her head frantically, scanning the perimeter of the grand hall. "Security! I need security in here immediately! Get this ignorant girl out of my house right now!" I looked down at her hand gripping my arm, and then I slowly looked back up into her flushed, panicked face. I did not try to pull away. I did not struggle or shout. I simply let a terrifying, absolute stillness wash over my entire body. "Remove your hand from my arm, Beatrice," I said. My voice was dangerously quiet, yet it carried perfectly across the tense room. "I strongly suggest you do not touch me again." Beatrice flinched as if she had just been struck physically. The sheer freezing authority in my voice caught her completely off guard. For 2 years, she had only known the quiet, compliant Naomi, who smiled politely while absorbing her relentless, passive-aggressive insults. She was entirely unprepared for the chief executive officer standing in front of her now. Her grip loosened slightly, but her pride refused to let her back down in front of the wealthy investors. "You are a caterer!" Beatrice screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceiling. "You are a nobody! How dare you come into my home and interrupt my son's presentation with your absolute nonsense? You do not understand a single thing about high finance or technology. You are just trying to ruin his big night because you are bitter and pathetic." Right on cue, Kendra abandoned her spot by the marble pillar and rushed over to join her mother. She positioned herself right next to Beatrice, crossing her arms tightly and glaring at me with eyes full of absolute venom. Kendra knew her $200,000 corporate bailout was rapidly slipping away, and she was desperate to spin the narrative to save the seed funding. "Do not listen to a single word she says," Kendra yelled, addressing the wealthy men sitting in the audience. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "She is not just a caterer. She is a jealous, uneducated gold digger. She has been obsessed with my brother for months. Jamal tried to break it off with her because she is completely unstable, and now she is trying to sabotage his company out of pure spite." I actually let out a short, genuine laugh. The absolute irony of her accusation was almost too perfect. Kendra, a woman currently facing federal charges for embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from her own employer, was standing in the middle of a stolen house, wearing a fake designer dress, calling me a gold digger. Jamal, a man who had literally tricked me into signing a fraudulent $250,000 loan to pay off his family's debts, was watching his sister call me a financial parasite. The psychological projection was truly a sight to behold. "A gold digger," I repeated, my voice dripping with heavy, unapologetic amusement. "That is a fascinating accusation, Kendra. Tell me exactly what gold am I supposedly digging for here? Because from where I am standing, this entire family is completely bankrupt both morally and financially." "Shut your mouth," Kendra snapped, stepping closer and attempting to physically intimidate me. "You live in a tiny, pathetic apartment. You wear cheap clothes. You are absolutely nothing compared to us. You thought you could trap my brother, but he saw right through you. He knows you are just a desperate leech. Now get out before we have you thrown out in handcuffs." Up on the stage, Jamal saw a fleeting opportunity to regain control of the room. He wiped his sweating forehead, gripped the microphone, and leaned heavily into his sister's fabricated narrative. "I sincerely apologize for this massive disruption," everyone, Jamal announced, forcing a deeply apologetic, sorrowful expression onto his face. "My sister is right. This woman is a former acquaintance who has unfortunately become completely unhinged. She is clearly having a severe mental breakdown. I assure you her technical questions were nothing more than memorized gibberish. She pulled off the internet to try and sound intimidating. Please let us just remain calm while the staff removes her from the premises." The sheer audacity of his lie was breathtaking. He was actively trying to gaslight a room full of 60 financial experts, but the investors were not buying his pathetic story. They had heard my questions. They knew the profound level of technical expertise required to formulate those inquiries. You cannot simply memorize advanced algorithms about supply chain latency and neural node weighting from a quick internet search. The venture capitalists in the audience were watching this family meltdown with undisguised horror. These were men who conducted high-level due diligence for a living. They evaluated risk. They analyzed behavioral patterns to determine if a founder was stable enough to handle millions of dollars in venture capital. What they were witnessing right now was the exact opposite of stability. They were watching a mother violently grab a staff member. They were watching a sister scream unhinged insults like a reality television character. They were watching a supposedly brilliant tech founder hide behind the skirts of the women in his family because he could not answer a basic engineering question about his own product. I stood perfectly tall, letting Beatrice and Kendra throw their pathetic temper tantrum. Their hostility was not intimidating. It was just loud. It was the desperate noise of people who knew they had absolutely no real power. Beatrice was breathing heavily, the heavy makeup completely failing to hide the deep lines of stress and financial panic etched around her mouth. Kendra had her hands balled into tight fists, furious that her loud insults were not making me shrink away in tears. "You can call security, Beatrice," I said, keeping my tone remarkably calm. "You can call the local police. You can call anyone you want. But removing me from this room will not change the fact that the man standing on that stage is actively committing federal corporate fraud." "That is a complete lie," Jamal shouted into the microphone, his voice cracking violently. "Is it?" I challenged, my voice cutting cleanly through his panic. "Then tell the room, Jamal. Tell them what the baseline encryption key is for the primary firewall. Just say the alphanumeric sequence. If you built the software, you should know the password to your own house." He just stared at me, his mouth completely dry. He looked like he was going to be physically sick. The absolute silence from the stage was all the confirmation the room needed. The golden child was entirely exposed. Two large men wearing matching dark suits with earpieces pushed through the heavy wooden doors at the back of the hall. They were the private security guards the family had hired for the evening. They quickly assessed the chaotic scene and began marching down the center aisle toward me, their faces set in grim, serious expressions. Beatrice smiled triumphantly, a vicious, ugly gleam shining in her eyes. "It is over, you pathetic little girl," she sneered, stepping back to give the guards room. "You are going to be thrown out onto the street exactly where you belong. And tomorrow we are filing a restraining order. You will never come near my wealthy family again." I did not move. I did not look back at the approaching security guards. I kept my eyes locked dead onto Jamal. He thought he had won. He thought the hired muscle was going to drag me out the back door, allowing him to smooth things over and continue his multi-million-dollar theft. He was wrong. He had forgotten one very crucial detail. I was not just the true owner of the software he was presenting. I was also the primary vendor for the most powerful man sitting in the room. The two security guards finally reached me. They stepped on either side of me, their large hands reaching out to grab my arms and physically escort me out of the building. Beatrice let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief, clearly thinking the nightmare was over. Kendra crossed her arms, a smug, satisfied smirk returning to her face. But I knew the real nightmare was just about to begin, because right as the guards placed their heavy hands on my shoulders, a sudden booming voice echoed from the front row. It was a voice filled with such immense, terrifying authority that the entire grand hall instantly froze in place. "Stop exactly where you are. Take your hands off that woman right now." The booming voice cut through the heavy, suffocating air of the grand hall like an absolute crack of thunder. The sound was so commanding, so entirely devoid of any hesitation, that the two massive security guards instantly froze in their tracks. Their heavy hands, which had been gripping my shoulders tightly just a fraction of a second earlier, immediately dropped to their sides. They took a synchronized step backward, their professional training recognizing raw, unfiltered power when they heard it. The entire room turned toward the front row. The man who had spoken was now standing perfectly upright, adjusting the cuffs of his immaculate custom-tailored suit. It was Richard Montgomery. He was the undisputed king of the city's venture capital district. He was a billionaire who had built his vast empire by ruthlessly dismantling weak companies and investing heavily in flawless architecture. He was the white whale Jamal had been desperately trying to harpoon all night. A single signature from Richard Montgomery could easily save the entire Watkins family from their impending financial ruin. Beatrice practically tripped over her own feet as she rushed forward, her face completely drained of color. She was terrified that the chaotic scene was going to scare away her son's biggest investor. She plastered a sickeningly sweet, desperately apologetic smile onto her face, completely ignoring me and focusing all her frantic energy on the billionaire. "Mr. Montgomery," Beatrice gasped, pressing her hand against her chest as if she were deeply wounded by the disruption. "I am so incredibly sorry for this horrible scene. The catering company we hired must have sent a highly unstable employee. She is clearly unwell. Please sit back down and allow security to remove her so Jamal can finish showing you his brilliant software." Kendra quickly stepped out from behind her mother, eagerly joining the frantic damage control effort. She nodded aggressively, directing a venomous glare in my direction. "Exactly," Sir Kendra chimed in, her voice dripping with fake professionalism. "She is just an obsessed ex-girlfriend trying to ruin my brother's big pitch because she is insanely jealous of his success. We are having her escorted off the property right now so we can resume the presentation." Richard Montgomery did not look at Beatrice. He did not look at Kendra. He completely ignored their frantic, desperate groveling, as if they were nothing more than annoying gnats buzzing around his head. His sharp, piercing blue eyes were locked dead onto me. Up on the stage, Jamal was completely falling apart. The microphone picked up his rapid, shallow breathing. He gripped the edges of the clear acrylic podium, desperately trying to pivot the attention back to his stolen slides. Sir Jamal called out, his voice cracking horribly. "I assure you the software architecture is perfectly sound. If we could just return our focus to the neural node waiting." Richard raised a single hand. He did not yell. He did not even look up at the stage. He simply raised his hand, and Jamal instantly snapped his mouth shut, completely silenced by the sheer gravity of the older man's presence. The power dynamic in the room had shifted entirely. The wealthy investors in the audience sat in absolute silence, watching the tense standoff unfold with bated breath. Richard stepped out from his row and began walking slowly and deliberately down the center aisle. He was in his late 60s, but he moved with the aggressive confidence of an apex predator. He stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me. I did not shrink back. I did not drop my gaze. I stood perfectly tall, maintaining direct eye contact with one of the most ruthless businessmen in the country. I simply reached up and calmly adjusted the collar of my cheap black blouse where the security guards had wrinkled it. I knew exactly who Richard Montgomery was. His investment firm was the single largest client my company possessed. Just last month, my executive team at Apex Analytics had negotiated a massive multi-year renewal contract with his board of directors. However, my corporate policy was strictly stealth wealth and extreme privacy. I handled all my high-level meetings with Richard over highly secured, heavily encrypted video conferences. During those calls, I was always seated in my luxurious downtown office, wearing an impeccable designer blazer with my hair flawlessly styled. He had never seen me in person, And he certainly had never seen me standing in a wealthy family's living room wearing a cheap black catering apron. Richard stared at me, his sharp eyes intensely analyzing every single detail of my face. I could practically see the gears turning in his highly analytical mind. He was evaluating my posture. He was recalling the complete lack of fear in my voice when I was interrogating Jamal just moments ago. He was processing the highly specific, incredibly dense technical vocabulary I had used to systematically butcher the quantum logic presentation. Kendra, completely oblivious to the intense silent communication happening between Richard and myself, made a massive fatal miscalculation. She assumed Richard's silence meant he was waiting for the trash to be taken out. She stepped forward, reaching her hand out to forcefully shove my shoulder toward the waiting security guards. "Did you not hear him?" Kendra snapped, her voice shrill and arrogant. "Get moving right now before we press trespassing charges." Before Kendra's hand could even make contact with my clothing, Richard Montgomery turned his head slightly and delivered a verbal strike so incredibly cold it dropped the temperature of the entire room. "Do not touch her," Richard commanded, his voice deadly quiet, but carrying an explosive threat. Kendra recoiled instantly, ripping her hand back as if she had just tried to touch a burning stove. She stumbled backward, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. Beatrice gasped again, her hands flying to her mouth. They could not comprehend why the billionaire they were trying to impress was actively defending the unstable caterer. Richard turned his attention completely back to me. He took one step closer, invading my personal space, testing my resolve. I held my ground perfectly, my expression remaining a flawless mask of serene confidence. I did not need to scream or throw a tantrum to prove my power. My silence was deafening. He tilted his head slightly to the side, his eyes narrowing as he studied the exact structure of my face. He listened to the steady, calm rhythm of my breathing. He was matching the woman standing in front of him with the powerful, commanding voice he had heard dominating his boardroom conference calls for the past 3 years. The cheap apron and the messy hair were no longer acting as a sufficient disguise. The brilliant data scientist beneath the uniform was shining through too brightly to be ignored. A slow, distinct look of profound realization washed over Richard's weathered face. His eyes widened slightly, not in anger, but in sheer, unadulterated shock. The corners of his mouth twitched as the massive puzzle pieces finally snapped together in his mind. He looked past me toward the heavy silver tray resting on the back table, and then he looked back at my face. "Wait a minute," Richard said, his voice dropping to a low, completely stunned whisper that echoed through the dead, silent hall. "I know you." Richard Montgomery narrowed his eyes, the harsh lines of his weathered face softening as a profound realization washed over him. The aggressive, intimidating posture of the ruthless billionaire vanished instantly, replaced by a look of genuine respect and warm familiarity. He took another step forward, completely ignoring the 2 massive security guards who were now standing awkwardly like frozen statues. He extended his large, calloused hand directly toward me. "Naomi," Richard boomed, his deep voice carrying flawlessly to every single corner of the grand hall. "Naomi Evans. I thought I recognized that commanding voice of yours. What on earth is the chief executive officer of Apex Analytics doing serving hors d'oeuvres at a seed funding pitch?" The silence that immediately followed his words was not just quiet. It was a suffocating, absolute vacuum of sound. It was the terrifying, heavy silence that immediately follows a massive bomb detonation right in the split second before the devastating shockwave hits. I watched the psychological collapse of the Watkins family happen in real time. Up on the stage, Jamal physically recoiled, as if he had just been shot directly in the chest. His jaw unhinged, his mouth dropping wide open as his brain completely short-circuited. He looked frantically from Richard to me, and then back to Richard. His eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. He was trying desperately to process the words Chief Executive Officer and Apex Analytics in the exact same sentence as my name. The man who truly believed I typed mundane emails for a living was currently malfunctioning under the blinding projector light. Down in the front row, Beatrice was experiencing a complete physical shutdown. She stumbled backward, her expensive high heels catching roughly on the thick fibers of the Persian rug. She let out a strangled, pathetic gasp and blindly grabbed the back of a plush velvet chair to stop herself from collapsing completely onto the floor. All the blood instantly drained from her heavily contoured face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost wearing a counterfeit emerald dress. The woman who had just loudly mocked my tiny apartment and my cheap clothes was now staring at a billionaire treating me like his equal. Beside her, Kendra looked as if she were about to violently vomit. Her smug, arrogant smirk evaporated into raw, suffocating panic. Her jaw trembled uncontrollably. She had just called me an uneducated gold digger in front of 60 financial experts, completely unaware that I was the wealthiest person in the entire room, aside from the billionaire currently reaching out to shake my hand. I did not break eye contact with Richard. I reached behind my waist. I slowly, deliberately untied the rough, cheap strings of the black catering apron. I pulled the heavy fabric over my head and let it fall from my hands. It hit the hardwood floor with a soft thud, but in that perfectly silent room, it sounded like a heavy iron curtain dropping permanently on the Watkins family and their entire fake dynasty. I stepped over the discarded apron, no longer the invisible hired help, and firmly grasped Richard's extended hand. "Good evening, Richard," I said, returning his firm handshake with the exact same level of executive confidence. "It is a pleasure to finally see you in person. I must admit, I usually prefer our highly secured encrypted video conferences from my downtown office, but tonight presented a very unique, unexpected networking opportunity." Richard let out a booming, genuine laugh that shattered the remaining tension in the room. He shook his head, completely oblivious to the horrifying family drama actively unfolding around us. "I was just reviewing the quarterly latency reports your engineering team sent over to my board on Tuesday," Richard said, his tone entirely conversational and full of professional admiration. "Brilliant work as always, Naomi. Your new data clustering protocols are saving my firm millions. But seriously, what is the meaning of this uniform? Are you conducting some kind of undercover sociological experiment on the local elite?" I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp smile that did not reach my eyes. "Something like that, Richard. I was invited here tonight under the impression that I was attending an intimate family engagement dinner to celebrate my upcoming wedding to Mr. Watkins." I gestured casually toward the stage where Jamal was currently sweating entirely through his tailored suit. But upon my arrival, I continued, my voice perfectly level and calm. I was handed a crumpled $50 bill, a stack of heavy coats, and strictly instructed to make myself useful as the catering staff. I decided to play along to see exactly what kind of business operations were being conducted behind my back. It turns out it was an incredibly educational experience. The wealthy venture capitalists sitting in the plush velvet chairs were not fools. They were highly intelligent men who made billions of dollars by recognizing patterns and connecting dots. The murmurs instantly erupted across the grand hall, loud, chaotic, and filled with deep, undeniable anger. "Apex Analytics," a man in the third row whispered loudly to his business partner. "That is a $50 million firm. She is the founder. I read an article about her stealth wealth approach in a financial journal last month." Another prominent investor sitting near the aisle pointed a rigid finger directly toward the stage. "He stole her product. That is exactly why she knew the precise latency degradation percentage and the neural node weighting flaws. It is her proprietary software on those slides." The entire room turned on Jamal in a matter of seconds. The atmosphere shifted from professional curiosity to absolute ruthless hostility. The wealthy men who were fully prepared to write him massive seed capital checks just 20 minutes ago were now glaring at him like he was a highly contagious, disgusting disease. He was no longer a visionary tech founder. He was a pathetic, desperate thief who had brought the actual brilliant creator of the stolen software to his own fraudulent pitch and then had the sheer mind-boggling audacity to force her to serve them champagne and crab cakes. I looked back up at the stage. Jamal was gripping his chest, his breath coming in short, erratic, terrified gasps. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of his catastrophic miscalculation was actively crushing him alive. He had spent 2 entire years hunting for a naive, gullible victim with a perfect credit score to exploit. He thought he had found an easy target to fund his family's fake lifestyle. Instead, he had unknowingly invited an apex predator directly into his fragile, crumbling glass house, handed her a heavy sledgehammer, and practically begged her to start swinging. The power in the room was now entirely mine. Every single eye was glued to me, waiting to see exactly how I was going to execute the man standing terrified on the stage. Jamal practically threw himself off the low stage. His survival instinct had completely overridden whatever tiny fraction of rational thought he had left in his brain. He realized in a fraction of a second that his entire multi-million-dollar scam was rapidly disintegrating into dust. The only possible way out of this catastrophic nightmare was to immediately attach himself to my profound success. He had to convince the room full of angry billionaires that my sudden appearance as the wealthy chief executive officer was actually part of his brilliant master plan all along. He bounded down the center aisle toward me, his expensive leather shoes slapping loudly against the hardwood floor. He forced a massive, wildly enthusiastic smile onto his face, completely ignoring the thick layer of nervous sweat shining on his forehead. He let out a loud, booming laugh that sounded incredibly hollow and deeply unhinged. Babe, Jamal practically shouted, throwing his arms out wide as if he were greeting me after a long vacation. "You know Richard Montgomery. Why did you not tell me my beautiful fiancé was already acquainted with our lead investor?" He did not wait for me to answer. He immediately turned his body to face the crowd of wealthy venture capitalists, desperately trying to project the image of a powerful, unified couple. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his eyes wide with a manic, terrifying energy. "Look at her, everyone!" Jamal announced, his voice echoing shrilly across the grand hall. "This is my brilliant fiancée Naomi. We are co-founders. I know her little catering outfit might seem confusing, but she has always possessed an incredibly quirky sense of humor. She is the technical genius behind the quantum logic algorithms, and I am the visionary business mind bringing it to market. We built this entire platform together in our living room. Is that not right, baby?" He stepped directly into my personal space, reaching his sweating hands out to grab my waist. He intended to pull me into a tight embrace, to kiss my cheek in front of the entire room, and physically force me to play the role of the loving, supportive partner. He thought that if he could just get his hands on me, if he could just project the illusion of our romance, the wealthy investors would calm down and open their checkbooks. He was entirely wrong. The moment his fingers brushed against the fabric of my black blouse, I took one sharp, deliberate step backward. I did not flinch, and I did not cower. I simply created an impenetrable physical boundary between us. "Do not touch me," I commanded. My voice was not loud. I did not scream, but the sheer freezing temperature of my tones stopped him dead in his tracks. The fake, enthusiastic smile instantly shattered, sliding off his face like wet clay. His arms hung awkwardly in the air, suspended in the space between us. I looked him dead in the eyes, my expression a mask of absolute terrifying calm. I methodically raised my voice, ensuring that every single person in the grand hall heard my next words with crystal clarity. "Do not ever put your hands on me again, Jamal," I stated clearly. "We are not co-founders. We are not partners. And as of this exact second, we are absolutely not engaged." A collective audible gasp rippled through the audience of investors. Down in the front row, Beatrice let out a soft, pathetic whimper, sinking heavily into her plush velvet chair. She buried her face in her trembling hands, finally realizing that the wealthy woman she had just violently grabbed and ordered security to throw out was actually the only person who could have saved her family from total bankruptcy. Near the marble pillar, Kendra was staring at me with her mouth hanging wide open. her smug arrogance entirely replaced by the crushing realization that her federal embezzlement charges were now completely unavoidable. Jamal stood frozen in the center aisle, looking like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and was waiting for the inevitable detonation. He opened his mouth to speak to try and spin another pathetic lie, but he possessed absolutely no leverage left. I completely turned my back on him. I dismissed his entire existence and directed my full, undivided attention to the 60 wealthy venture capitalists sitting in the room. These were men who understood the brutal, unforgiving language of corporate warfare, and I was about to give them a masterclass. Gentlemen, I began projecting my executive voice with flawless precision. I deeply apologize that your valuable time was completely wasted this evening. You were invited here under the false pretense of evaluating a revolutionary tech startup. I am officially informing you that the company known as Quantum Logic does not exist. It has no engineers, it has no infrastructure, and it certainly has no proprietary algorithms. I slowly raised my hand and pointed a single finger directly at the massive glowing projector screen at the front of the room. The complex data visualization chart was still illuminating the stage. Every single slide in that presentation is stolen intellectual property, I announced. That software architecture was developed exclusively by the engineering team at Apex Analytics. It is a highly classified, heavily encrypted corporate asset. 3 weeks ago, the man currently standing behind me faked a severe migraine, stayed home from work, and illegally accessed my secure home office network. He bypassed my firewall, downloaded my encrypted files onto an external flash drive, and printed them into those cheap, glossy brochures sitting on your tables. The wealthy investors immediately began picking up the brochures from the glass tables, looking at them not with admiration, but with deep, profound disgust. They dropped the thick cardstock back onto the tables as if the paper were physically burning their hands. You are all seasoned veterans of the financial sector. I continued, my eyes scanning the room, making direct eye contact with the most powerful men in the audience. You know exactly how strict the federal regulations are regarding corporate espionage and the theft of proprietary algorithms. Apex Analytics handles highly sensitive predictive data for massive national logistics firms and major international banks. The theft of this software is not a simple domestic dispute. It is a massive multi-million-dollar federal crime. I paused for exactly 2 seconds, letting the severe gravity of the situation settle heavily over the room. I watched several investors immediately reach into their suit jackets, pulling out their cell phones and furiously typing messages to their legal teams. Therefore, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute, uncompromising authority. I am issuing a formal verbal cease and desist order right here and right now. If any individual in this room writes a check to Jamal Watkins tonight, if a single dollar of seed capital is transferred into his bank accounts or the accounts of his fake shell company, if anyone attempts to fund, purchase, or distribute any portion of the software presented here this evening, my corporate legal team will show absolutely no mercy. I looked directly at the prominent venture capitalist, sitting in the second row, the one who had demanded that I be allowed to speak earlier. He nodded slowly, clearly respecting the ruthless boundary I was establishing. Any investor who touches this fraudulent project will be officially named as a willing co-conspirator in a federal corporate espionage lawsuit by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, I promised them. We will freeze your assets, we will subpoena your entire communication history, and we will drag your firms through a brutal, highly public legal battle that will completely destroy your professional reputations. Do not let this desperate con artist drag you down into his sinking ship. The reaction was instantaneous and absolute. The room erupted into a flurry of panicked movement. Men in expensive tailored suits stood up simultaneously, grabbing their leather briefcases and their overcoats. They did not even bother to say goodbye or offer a polite excuse. They were practically climbing over each other to get to the front doors, terrified of being legally associated with the Watkins family in any capacity whatsoever. Jamal spun around desperately, reaching his hands out toward the fleeing billionaires. "Wait, please wait!" he cried out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Please let me explain. The software is mine. She is lying. She is just trying to ruin me. But nobody was listening to him. Richard Montgomery stepped forward, placing a firm protective hand on my shoulder. He looked at Jamal with an expression of such absolute pure disgust that it made my blood run cold. "You are a remarkably stupid young man," Richard said quietly, his voice carrying the heavy, fatal weight of a judge delivering a final sentence. "You had a brilliant, immensely successful woman standing right by your side, and you treated her like garbage. You are completely finished in this city, Watkins. I will personally make sure you never secure a single meeting in the financial district for the rest of your miserable life." The grand hall, which had been buzzing with the promise of immense wealth just 30 minutes ago, was rapidly emptying out. The fake empire Jamal had meticulously tried to build using my stolen genius was collapsing right in front of his eyes. He fell to his knees on the thick Persian rug, burying his face in his hands, completely destroyed by the very woman he had brought in to serve his drinks. The grand hall was rapidly emptying, the heavy wooden doors swinging wildly as the wealthy investors fled the toxic wreckage of the Watkins family. Jamal remained on his knees in the center aisle, his face buried in his hands, quietly sobbing, as the reality of his total destruction finally crushed him. Richard Montgomery stood firmly by my side, acting as a silent, imposing guardian of my executive authority. The sheer magnitude of the victory should have been enough to silence the remaining family members completely. Any rational person would have recognized that the war was over and they had suffered a catastrophic, irreversible defeat. But Kendra was not a rational person. She was a deeply entitled, highly narcissistic woman who was staring down the barrel of a federal embezzlement charge. Her brain simply refused to process the reality of the situation. As the last few venture capitalists hurried out the door, Kendra suddenly let out a shrill, completely unhinged scream. She aggressively shoved past her weeping mother, her fake designer heels stomping heavily against the hardwood floor as she marched directly toward me. Her face was flushed a furious mottled red, and the veins in her neck were bulging with pure, unfiltered rage. "You are completely bluffing!" Kendra shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the high ceiling. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face, her eyes wide with a manic, desperate delusion. "You are not a chief executive officer. You do not own any multi-million-dollar data analytics firm. You are just a pathetic, broke virtual assistant who memorized some big words to try and ruin my brother's life." I did not move. Richard shifted his weight slightly, preparing to intervene if she tried to physically attack me, but I raised my hand slightly to signal that I had the situation completely under control. I wanted Kendra to keep talking. I wanted her to keep digging her own grave as deep as she possibly could. "You are nothing but a liar." Kendra continued to scream, stepping closer, but maintaining just enough distance to stay out of Richard's immediate reach. "You think you are so incredibly smart because you brought down this presentation. You think you won, but you have absolutely no idea what is actually happening. You are just a naive, stupid girl, and you are going to be paying for my lifestyle for the rest of your miserable life." Down in the front row, Beatrice suddenly lifted her head from her hands. She recognized the dangerous territory her daughter was rapidly sprinting toward. "Kendra, stop talking!" Beatrice gasped, her voice hoarse and completely terrified. "Just stop talking right now." But Kendra was entirely too far gone. The adrenaline and the sheer terror of her impending prison sentence had completely hijacked her mouth. She looked around the room, taking in the few remaining catering staff members, the security guards, and the billionaire standing next to me. She wanted to humiliate me. She wanted to prove to everyone that I was still the clueless victim they had actively plotted to destroy. "Did you really think Jamal loved you?" Kendra laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that contained absolutely no joy. "He was using you since the very first day you met. We all were. You were so busy playing the sweet, supportive girlfriend that you did not even bother to read the legal documents he handed you this morning. You thought you were signing a joint apartment lease. You actually thought my brother wanted to move in with you." Jamal slowly raised his head from his hands. His eyes widened in absolute horror as he realized what his sister was doing. He reached a shaking hand out toward her. "Kendra, shut up," Jamal pleaded weakly, his voice cracking. "Please shut up." She completely ignored him, her manic gaze locked entirely onto me. "You signed your name as the sole guarantor on a massive high-interest personal loan," Kendra boasted loudly, her voice dripping with venomous triumph. $250,000 completely anchored to your perfect little credit score. And the best part is the bank already approved the application this morning. The funds are actively clearing as we speak. She took a deep theatrical breath, clearly savoring the taste of what she believed was her ultimate victory. I stood perfectly still, letting her confess to aggravated bank fraud and identity theft in front of a room full of witnesses. "I am going to take that money," Kendra sneered, stepping aggressively into my personal space. "I am going to use your perfect credit to pay off my own personal corporate debts. And when the bank comes looking for their monthly payments, you are going to be the one on the hook. You are going to be working double shifts, pouring coffee, and typing emails for the next 20 years just to keep yourself out of bankruptcy. So do not stand there in my house and act like you are some powerful corporate executive. You are just a broke girl who got played by a real family." Richard Montgomery let out a low, deeply amused chuckle. He looked at Kendra as if she were a fascinating, incredibly stupid insect under a microscope. "Miss Watkins." Richard said, his voice entirely calm and conversational. "Did you just publicly confess to conspiring to commit wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny in front of a billionaire, a private security team, and the actual victim of the crime? Because if you did, I must admit, that is the single most breathtaking display of sheer stupidity I have ever witnessed in my 40 years of business." Kendra scoffed, flipping her hair over her shoulder with absolute arrogance. She completely dismissed Richard's, warning her mind entirely focused on the massive financial bailout she believed was sitting safely in the banking queue. "It is not fraud if she signed the papers willingly," Kendra shot back smoothly. "She is just an idiot who does not read contracts, and there is absolutely nothing she can do to stop it now. The transaction is already locked into the banking mainframe." Right on cue, a sharp, distinct chime echoed from the small designer clutch tucked under Kendra's arm. It was the exact custom notification sound assigned to her premier banking application. Kendra's face instantly lit up with a brilliant, triumphant smile. She reached into her purse and pulled out her latest model smartphone, holding it up high in the air, as if she had just won an Olympic gold medal. "See that?" Kendra gloated, waving the illuminated screen in my direction. "That is the final bank alert. That is the notification confirming that the funds have successfully bonded to your credit profile. The money is officially ours, and you are officially ruined. Checkmate, Naomi." She lowered the phone, still wearing that sickeningly smug smile, and tapped the screen to open the notification. She wanted to see the massive account balance refresh in real time. She wanted to bask in the numerical proof of her successful heist. I watched her face with absolute clinical precision. I did not blink. I wanted to burn this exact sequence of events into my memory forever. Kendra looked down at the bright digital display. The smug, arrogant smile froze on her lips for exactly 1 second. Then it completely shattered. The blood instantly drained from her perfectly contoured cheeks. Her skin turned a sickly pale shade of ash. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Her dark eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror as they rapidly scanned the text on the screen. Her hand began to tremble so violently that she almost dropped the expensive phone onto the hardwood floor. It was not an approval notification. It was not a successful transfer alert. It was a Level 1 federal fraud alert. Harrison, my incredibly efficient corporate attorney, had executed my exact instructions with flawless timing. The alert currently glowing on Kendra's screen was an automated message from the Executive Security Division of her bank. It was officially informing her that a fraudulent transaction had been flagged as an active felony. It stated that due to her direct association with the fraudulent application, her personal checking account, her savings account, and her corporate expense accounts had been immediately and permanently frozen by federal mandate. No, Kendra whispered. The word barely escaped her lips. It sounded like the final pathetic gasp of a dying animal. She frantically tapped the screen with her shaking thumb, trying to refresh the application, trying to force the numbers to change. But the screen simply flashed red, displaying a large padlock icon over her completely locked accounts. No, this is a mistake. Kendra stammered, her breathing accelerating into a rapid, hyperventilating panic. She looked up at me, her eyes completely wild. This is a banking error. The system is down. It says my accounts are frozen. It says there is a federal lock on my profile. I took one slow, deliberate step forward, completely closing the distance between us. The time for silent observation was over. The trap had fully snapped shut, and it was time to let her feel the incredibly sharp teeth holding her entirely in place. That is not a banking error, Kendra, I said smoothly. My voice cut through her frantic hyperventilating like a sharpened blade. That is the direct consequence of underestimating the woman you invited into your home. Kendra stared at me, her mouth hanging completely open. Her hands were shaking so violently that she finally dropped her expensive smartphone. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, heavy crack, the red federal lock screen still glowing brightly against the polished wood. What did you do? Kendra whispered, her voice completely devoid of its previous arrogance. She looked exactly like a terrified child who had just been caught playing with matches. I did exactly what I always do when I encounter a hostile corporate threat. I replied, my tone completely clinical and detached. I neutralized it. 25 minutes ago, while you were busy ordering me to make sure the crab cakes were hot, I contacted my lead corporate attorney. I instructed him to bypass the standard banking queues and contact the Executive Fraud Division directly. I had him flag your fraudulent $250,000 personal loan application as an active malicious felony in progress. A loud, pathetic groan echoed from the center aisle. Jamal was trying to pull himself up from the floor using the edge of a plush velvet chair for support, but his legs were completely giving out underneath him. He looked like a man who had just been hit by a massive invisible freight train. You did not just cancel the loan, Jamal choked out, his eyes wide with sheer horror as the reality of my words finally penetrated his panicked brain. Canceling the loan would have allowed you to simply invent another lie and try another scam tomorrow, I explained, turning my cold gaze toward him. I do not leave loose ends, Jamal. By flagging the transaction as an active felony, the federal government was legally obligated to step in immediately. They have officially placed a hard lock on every single financial account tied to your name, Kendra's name, and your parents' accounts as well. Your entire family is now completely and utterly financially paralyzed. Beatrice let out a piercing, dramatic shriek from the front row. She clutched her chest, her fake emerald dress heaving as she began to hyperventilate. Roland? Her husband finally rushed over to her side, his face pale and completely covered in a thick layer of cold sweat. They were entirely ruined, and they knew it. You cannot do this to us. Kendra sobbed, tears finally spilling over her heavy makeup and leaving dark black streaks streaming down her cheeks. You are destroying my life. The corporate auditors are coming to my office on Monday. If I do not have that money to replace what I embezzled, I am going to federal prison. You destroyed your own life the second you decided to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from your employer, I stated coldly. And you permanently sealed your own fate the second you decided to use my identity to cover up your pathetic crimes. I reached into the pocket of my black slacks and pulled out my own smartphone. The screen illuminated instantly, recognizing my face. I swiped past my highly encrypted work emails and opened the smart home audio application. Jamal loved to brag to his wealthy friends about his massive, incredibly expensive surround sound speaker system. He had spent thousands of dollars wiring premium audio equipment into the ceiling of every single room in the massive estate. Months ago, he had forced me to download the master control application to my phone so I could serve as the designated disc jockey during his lavish networking parties. He wanted me to ensure the background jazz music was always playing at the perfect volume while I silently cleaned up empty crystal glasses and scrubbed the kitchen counters. He had literally handed me the master administrator password to his entire house, completely unaware that he was handing a massive security vulnerability directly to an elite data scientist. I tapped the bright screen instantly, overriding the soft instrumental music that had been quietly playing in the adjoining dining room. The entire house went entirely silent. The heavy speakers mounted in the high ceiling hummed with a low, barely audible static, waiting for my command. "You asked earlier how I knew about your little loan scheme," I said, holding my phone up so Kendra and Jamal could clearly see the illuminated screen. "You assumed I was just a clueless, uneducated victim who blindly signed whatever legal documents were placed in front of her. But my entire career is built on identifying discrepancies and capturing raw information. I never miss a single detail." I opened the voice memo application. The digital audio file I had recorded while standing outside the cracked study door was sitting right at the top of the list, perfectly trimmed, fully processed, and ready for public broadcast. "Wait, Naomi, please," Jamal begged. He released his grip on the velvet chair and fell back down to his knees on the thick rug. He finally realized exactly what I was holding. He recognized the ultimate threat. "Do not do this, please. We can fix this. I will call the bank right now. I will confess to the loan. I will give you whatever you want. Just please do not play that." I looked down at the man who had manipulated me, lied to me, and actively tried to destroy my future for his own selfish gain. He was begging for mercy, but I had absolutely none left to give. "I already have everything I want, Jamal," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing whisper. "I have the absolute truth." I pressed my thumb down firmly on the digital play button and used my other hand to crank the master volume slider all the way up to the absolute maximum limit. A sharp, distinct click echoed aggressively from the heavy wall-mounted speakers, positioned in every single corner of the grand hall. And then the audio recording began to play. The pristine, high-fidelity acoustic system that Jamal had spent a small fortune installing performed its job with absolute terrifying perfection. The heavy speakers mounted in the vaulted ceilings did not just play the audio. They amplified it, pushing every single panicked breath and cruel whisper into every corner of the grand hall. First came the sound of Kendra hyperventilating. Her voice was shrill and desperate, entirely stripped of the fake high society polish she usually wore. "I am going to prison, Jamal!" Her recorded voice cried out from the ceiling. "The corporate auditing team is coming in on Monday. They already flagged the offshore transfers. $200,000 is missing from the company accounts." A collective, horrifying gasp echoed from the remaining catering staff and the security guards standing near the back doors. Richard Montgomery crossed his arms over his broad chest, his jaw locking into a tight, unforgiving line. He was a man who had built his vast fortune on trust and precise mathematics. Hearing a blatant confession of corporate embezzlement from a woman who had just moments ago called me a gold digger was the ultimate confirmation of their absolute depravity. But the recording was far from over. Jamal was up next. "Keep your voice down," the digital version of Jamal hissed aggressively through the surround sound speakers. "You are not going to prison, Kendra. I told you I had it handled." Down on the floor, the real Jamal squeezed his eyes shut and covered his ears with his shaking hands, as if he could somehow block out the sound of his own destruction. But the speakers were too loud. There was absolutely nowhere for him to hide. "I do not need to produce the money," the recorded. Jamal continued, his tone dripping with a sickening, arrogant confidence. "Naomi is producing it for us. Her credit score is absolutely flawless. I saw her mail once, not a single late payment, zero debt, perfect financial history. She is incredibly naive and trusts me completely. So this morning while she was making breakfast, I handed her a massive stack of legal documents. I told her it was the joint lease agreement for that luxury penthouse downtown." Beatrice let out another loud, dramatic sob. She pressed her hands against her cheeks, her eyes darting frantically around the room. She was watching her perfect golden child be exposed as a highly manipulative sociopathic con artist. The man she had bragged about to her wealthy friends was currently confessing to federal identity theft on a beautifully balanced audio equalizer. It was a high-interest personal loan application. The audio playback continued relentlessly. With her perfect credit history, she easily qualified as the sole guarantor for $250,000. She signed everything without reading a single page. She practically handed us a blank check. The bank approved the application an hour ago. The funds are being wired directly into my personal account first thing tomorrow morning. I watched Kendra as her own voice replied on the recording. So you are just going to steal her credit, the digital, Kendra whispered. What happens when the bank comes after her for the money? Not my problem, the recorded, Jamal replied coldly. His cruel, dismissive words hung in the air like toxic smoke. Once the funds clear tomorrow, I will transfer your $200,000 to cover your little embezzlement mistake, so you do not go to federal prison. I will keep the remaining $50,000 as my cut for saving your pathetic life. And then I pack my bags, block her number, and drop her completely. Let her spend the next 20 years working double shifts as a virtual assistant to pay off the massive debt. She is just dead weight anyway. The audio recording ended with a sharp, abrupt click. The heavy speakers returned to a low, barely audible static. The silence that followed was entirely different from the silence that had occurred earlier. Before, the room had been quiet, with shock. Now the room was quiet with absolute suffocating disgust. The two massive security guards who had been fully prepared to physically throw me out of the estate just 10 minutes ago were now glaring at Jamal and Kendra with unfiltered contempt. They were hard-working men. They knew exactly what it meant to struggle to build a life and to protect their credit. Hearing two spoiled, arrogant children casually plot to destroy an innocent woman's entire financial future for their own selfish gain made them physically sick. Richard Montgomery slowly turned his head and looked down at Jamal. The billionaire did not yell. He did not need to. His quiet observation was far more lethal than any shouted insult. Dead weight, Richard repeated, his deep voice carrying a terrifying, lethal edge. He looked back at me, the chief executive officer of a $50 million data analytics firm, and then back down at the pathetic man kneeling on the floor. You truly are the most spectacular idiot I have ever had the misfortune of meeting in my entire life. Jamal slowly lowered his hands from his ears. He looked up at me, his face completely covered in a mixture of sweat and tears. He had absolutely nothing left to say. His charming lies had been entirely neutralized. His fake tech startup had been exposed as stolen intellectual property. His massive federal bank fraud had been intercepted, flagged as an active felony, and broadcasted to the entire room. He was a completely broken man, entirely stripped of his false armor. Kendra was still staring blankly at the dark screen of her dropped smartphone, her brain simply unable to process the sheer magnitude of the prison sentence waiting for her on Monday morning. She had tried to humiliate me. She had tried to paint me as the villain. But the unedited, undeniable truth had burned her entire narrative completely to the ground. I stood in the center of the grand hall, feeling an incredible, deeply satisfying wave of absolute peace wash over my mind. For 2 years, I had compromised my own comfort to fit into their incredibly toxic, judgmental world. I had hidden my massive success. I had tolerated their endless passive-aggressive insults. I had allowed them to treat me like I was entirely invisible. But I was not invisible anymore. I was the architect of their total and complete destruction. And the best part was that they had handed me every single tool I needed to tear their house down. I locked my smartphone and slipped it quietly back into my pocket. The digital trap had been successfully sprung, and the prey was bleeding out on the expensive Persian rug. As the reality of the situation fully settled over the room, the dynamic shifted once again. The wealthy investors were gone. The fake startup was dead. But the immediate terrifying threat of law enforcement was rapidly approaching. The federal fraud alert I had triggered through my attorney was not just a warning. It was an active distress beacon sent directly to the authorities. Over in the front row, Roland finally found his voice. Jamal's father had remained entirely silent throughout the entire confrontation, paralyzed by the sudden collapse of his family's reputation. But as he looked at his weeping wife, his catatonic daughter, and his destroyed son, A new kind of desperate panic ignited in his eyes. He realized that the federal authorities were not just going to stop at Jamal and Kendra. When the financial investigators started digging into the Watkins family accounts, they were going to find Roland's massive defaulted mortgages and his own highly illegal accounting practices. He had to stop this. He had to silence me before the police arrived. He pushed himself out of his velvet chair, his face a mask of frantic, desperate calculation. He adjusted his cheap tie and took a hesitant step toward me, completely unaware that he was about to step directly into the final fatal trap I had set for this wretched family. Roland took a hesitant step toward me, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the thick Persian rug. His face was entirely devoid of color, covered in a cold, heavy sweat that made him look 10 years older than he had just an hour ago. He saw the complete destruction of his son and his daughter, but his primary concern was the rapidly approaching financial investigation that would inevitably shine a blinding spotlight onto his own illegal activities. He desperately needed to extinguish the fire before the authorities arrived. "Naomi, please," Roland said, his voice dropping to a harsh, frantic whisper. He completely ignored the severe, intimidating presence of Richard Montgomery standing right next to me. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, attempting to project the image of a reasonable patriarch trying to calm a hysterical situation. "Let us step into the hallway. We do not need to involve federal investigators. We are family. We can handle this privately, just between us." He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek monogrammed leather checkbook. His hands were shaking so violently that he could barely hold the silver pen he produced from his other pocket. "I will write you a check right now." Roland offered, his eyes darting nervously toward the heavy wooden doors where the security guards were still standing. $50,000, clean and simple. You take the money, you cancel the fraud alert, and you walk away. We keep this family business strictly private. You do not need to ruin everyone over a simple misunderstanding. I stared at the leather checkbook trembling in his hand. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for him. This was the man who had raised Jamal and Kendra to be arrogant, entitled predators. This was the man who had sat at the head of the dinner table for the past 2 years, silently endorsing his wife's cruel insults and his son's manipulative lies. He was the rotting root of this entire toxic family tree. I let out a laugh. It was not a quiet, polite chuckle. It was a loud, genuine laugh that echoed brightly across the silent, tense room. The sound completely unnerved him. Roland took a small step backward, clutching his checkbook tightly against his chest, as if I had just physically threatened him. "Keep family business private," I repeated, my voice dripping with absolute, unapologetic amusement. "Roland, you do not have a family business. You have a highly orchestrated criminal enterprise masquerading as a high society dynasty. And as for your incredibly generous offer of $50,000, you can put your silver pen away. I do not accept bad checks." Roland's jaw tightened. He tried to puff out his chest, attempting to muster a final shred of his fake aristocratic dignity. "I am a highly respected financial consultant," he blustered, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "My checks do not bounce." "They absolutely do," I countered smoothly, stepping forward to close the distance between us. "When your son pulled me into the pantry earlier this evening and begged me to wear a catering apron, I realized something was deeply wrong with this picture. So while I was pouring your expensive champagne, I used my secure mobile network to run a comprehensive deep dive background check on the entire Watkins family portfolio. I own a data analytics firm, Roland. Uncovering hidden financial assets is literally what I do for a living, and what I found under your name was absolutely pathetic." Roland's eyes widened in pure, unadulterated terror. He opened his mouth to stop me, but the words died in his throat. I looked directly at Richard Montgomery, ensuring the billionaire heard every single word of my financial autopsy before turning my gaze back to Roland. "Your accounts are heavily leveraged to the absolute legal limit," I announced, my voice ringing with clinical precision. "You have maxed out 7 different commercial credit lines. The luxury vehicles parked in the circular driveway outside are 4 months behind on their lease payments. And this beautiful, massive estate we are currently standing in has 3 separate mortgages on it, all of which are actively in default. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings against you 30 days ago. Beatrice let out another strangled gasp from the front row, completely humiliated that her carefully guarded poverty was being broadcasted to the remaining staff and security personnel. You do not possess $50,000, Roland, I stated coldly. Your checking accounts are completely overdrawn. If you wrote that check right now, it would bounce before the ink even had a chance to dry on the paper. You are completely bankrupt. You knew Jamal was stealing my intellectual property to fund a fake startup because it was the only way you were going to save this house. You are just as guilty as your children. The heavy leather checkbook slipped from Roland's trembling fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a dull thud. His shoulders completely collapsed inward. The imposing wealthy patriarch had been entirely stripped of his armor, reduced to a terrified, broke old man standing in the ruins of his own lies. Richard Montgomery let out a heavy, disgusted sigh. The billionaire had seen enough. He had witnessed the absolute bottom of human greed and arrogance, and he was entirely finished breathing the same air as the Watkins family. He stepped forward, his towering presence completely dominating the defeated family. He looked down at Roland, his expression radiating pure, unfiltered contempt. I have dealt with ruthless competitors and aggressive corporate raiders in my time, Richard said, his deep voice vibrating with anger. But I have never encountered a family quite as pathetic and morally bankrupt as yours. You tried to build your salvation by destroying a brilliant, innocent woman. Richard turned his sharp, icy gaze toward Jamal, who was still kneeling weakly on the rug. Listen to me very carefully, Watkins, Richard commanded, pointing a rigid finger at Jamal. I am going to make a few phone calls from my car on the ride home. By the time the sun comes up tomorrow, you and your father will be permanently blacklisted from the entire financial district. I am going to personally ensure that not a single bank, not a single venture capital firm, and not a single private investor will ever take a meeting with you again. Your professional reputations are entirely dead. The billionaire buttoned his suit jacket with a sharp, decisive movement. He turned to me, the anger instantly vanishing from his face, replaced by a look of deep professional respect. Naomi, Richard said, offering a polite nod. It was an absolute pleasure watching you work tonight. I will have my executive assistant call your office on Monday morning. We have a massive portfolio expansion coming up, and I want Apex Analytics handling the entire data migration. I look forward to our next meeting. Thank you, Richard, I replied, maintaining my perfect executive composure. Have a safe drive home. Richard Montgomery turned on his heel and marched out of the grand hall. As he pushed through the heavy wooden doors, the last remaining guests, the few curious investors who had lingered near the exit to watch the drama unfold, immediately scrambled to follow him out. They practically ran down the hallway, terrified of being caught in the blast radius of Richard's promised blacklist. The grand, lavish estate was rapidly emptying out the wealthy elites, fleeing the toxic environment like rats abandoning a sinking ship. The murmurs of the departing guests drifted back into the room. They were whispering loudly about the absolute disgrace of the Watkins family. They talked about the fake emerald dress, the stolen software, and the federal bank fraud. In less than an hour, Beatrice and Roland had lost the only thing they truly valued in this world, their pristine social standing. They were officially the laughingstock of the city. The sound of the heavy front doors slamming shut echoed through the silent house. The networking event was officially over. Beatrice could no longer withstand the crushing weight of her reality. The grand illusion she had spent decades maintaining was entirely shattered. She let out a loud, agonizing wail and collapsed heavily onto a plush velvet sofa. She buried her face in the expensive cushions, weeping uncontrollably as her entire world evaporated in real time. Her fake designer dress crumpled around her, a perfect physical representation of her empty, fraudulent life. Roland slowly sank down onto the sofa next to his weeping wife. He stared blankly at the expensive Persian rug, completely catatonic. Kendra was sitting on the floor a few feet away, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, rocking back and forth as she muttered to herself about the impending corporate auditors. Jamal remained frozen on his knees in the center aisle, looking exactly like a broken toy that had been completely discarded. The grand hall, which had been buzzing with arrogant laughter and the promise of millions of dollars just a short while ago, now resembled a quiet, devastated tomb. I stood in the exact center of the wreckage, wearing my cheap black slacks and my sensible shoes. I had walked into this house as the invisible, disrespected hired help. I was walking out as the undisputed conqueror. The heavy silence of the devastated grand hall was abruptly broken by the sharp sweeping glow of red and blue lights. The vibrant colors pierced through the massive front windows, dancing aggressively across the vaulted ceiling and casting long, distorted shadows across the expensive Persian rug. The flashing lights illuminated the pale, terrified faces of the Watkins family. The federal fraud alert I had instructed my attorney to trigger was not merely a digital roadblock. It was a direct distress beacon to the authorities, and law enforcement had responded with absolute precision. 3 loud, heavy knocks echoed from the massive oak front doors. The sound reverberated through the quiet house like the pounding of a final judge's gavel. The 2 private security guards who had stood completely still and listened to the entire audio confession just minutes prior did not hesitate. They walked swiftly across the foyer and pulled the heavy doors wide open, stepping aside to grant the officers immediate entry. 4 uniformed police officers stepped into the grand entryway, their duty belts shifting heavily against their dark uniforms. Their expressions were stern, professional, and entirely devoid of the deference this family was so accustomed to receiving. The lead officer stepped forward, his eyes scanning the chaotic scene of the weeping mother, the catatonic father, and the 2 completely broken siblings. "We are looking for Kendra Watkins and Jamal Watkins," the lead officer announced, his deep voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "We have received an executive alert from the Banking Fraud Division regarding a highly coordinated case of identity theft, forged financial documents, and attempted wire fraud." Beatrice let out another piercing theatrical shriek. She pushed herself off the plush velvet sofa and threw her body directly in front of Kendra, raising her trembling hands as if she could physically block the officers from doing their job. "You cannot come in here!" Beatrice screamed, her voice completely hysterical. "You have no right. We are a highly respected family. This is all a massive misunderstanding. That caterer is lying to you." Roland finally snapped out of his catatonic trance. He realized instantly that physically resisting the police would only give the financial investigators more ammunition to dig into his own deeply corrupted accounts. He grabbed his wife by the shoulders and forcefully pulled her back, his face a mask of cold, terrified defeat. "Beatrice, stop it right now," Roland hissed through clenched teeth. "You are making it worse. Sit down and shut your mouth." 2 officers walked past the struggling parents and approached Kendra. She was still sitting on the hardwood floor, hugging her knees to her chest. As the officers leaned down to assist her to her feet, Kendra suddenly snapped back into her delusion of grandeur. She violently swatted the officer's hand away and scrambled to her feet, adjusting the bodice of her fake designer dress. "Do not touch me!" Kendra snapped, jutting her chin out in a pathetic display of arrogance. "Do you have any idea who my father is? I am a corporate executive. I demand to speak to my attorney immediately. You cannot arrest me over a simple banking glitch." The officer did not blink. He did not care about her fake dress, her fake jewelry, or her fake status. He simply reached to his heavy utility belt and pulled out a pair of solid steel handcuffs. "Kendra Watkins, you are being placed under arrest for suspicion of aggravated identity theft and conspiracy to commit wire fraud," the officer stated calmly, grabbing her wrist and twisting her arm smoothly behind her back. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place echoed loudly through the room. The cold steel clamped down directly over her cheap, cubic zirconia bracelets. The reality of the situation finally shattered her arrogant facade completely. Kendra let out a loud, agonizing wail. The fight instantly drained out of her body and her knees buckled. The two officers had to physically support her weight as they marched her toward the front doors. Her expensive high heels dragged against the polished floor, her heavy makeup running down her face in thick, dark streaks. She looked back at me one final time, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror, begging for a mercy I did not possess. I simply stared back, my face an impenetrable mask of stone. The remaining officers turned their attention to Jamal. He had not moved from his spot on the floor. He simply raised his hands in the air, completely surrendering to the inevitable. They pulled him to his feet, informing him that he was being detained for questioning regarding the forged signatures and the stolen corporate data. They did not handcuff him inside the house, but they gripped his arms firmly and began marching him out into the cold night air. I calmly adjusted my cheap black blouse and followed them out the front doors. I had absolutely no desire to spend another second inside that toxic, crumbling estate. The crisp, cool night air hit my face, bringing an immediate sense of profound relief. The circular driveway was chaotic, illuminated entirely by the spinning red and blue lights of 3 parked police cruisers. The wealthy neighbors from the surrounding mansions had stepped out onto their manicured lawns, wrapping their expensive robes tightly around themselves, watching in absolute shock as the prestigious Watkins family was publicly dismantled. The officers guided Kendra into the back of the first cruiser. She was sobbing hysterically, completely humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood. As the officers walked Jamal toward the second vehicle, a sleek, immaculate black town car smoothly pulled into the driveway, gliding past the police cruisers. It stopped exactly 10 feet away from me. The driver, a highly professional man named David, wearing a crisp dark suit, immediately stepped out and opened the heavy rear passenger door for me. Jamal saw the luxury vehicle. He saw the pure, undeniable proof of the massive empire I commanded. He realized with absolute crushing finality exactly what he had thrown away for a pathetic, fraudulent loan. With a sudden, violent burst of desperate energy, Jamal ripped his arms out of the officer's grasp. He did not run toward the street. He ran directly toward me. He collapsed to his knees onto the hard, cold concrete of the driveway, completely ignoring the sharp pain. "Naomi, please," Jamal cried out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched wail. The officers immediately drew their tasers, but I raised my hand slightly, signaling that I was not in any physical danger. Jamal crawled forward, tears streaming down his face, completely abandoning any remaining shred of his masculine pride. "I am so sorry," Jamal sobbed, reaching out toward my sensible shoes, but terrified to actually touch me. "I love you. I swear I love you." It was the pressure. My family forced me to do it. I was desperate to save them. "Please, Naomi. Think of the last 2 years. Think of our memories together. I can be the man you want. Just tell them to let me go. I will give you everything." I stood by the open door of the luxurious town car and looked down at the pathetic, weeping man kneeling in the dirt. He was still trying to manipulate me. He was still trying to blame his family for his own calculated, malicious choices. He was a parasite desperately trying to reattach itself to a host. I did not scream. I did not hurl insults at him. I did not even offer him the basic dignity of a verbal response. I simply looked into his desperate, tear-filled eyes, turned my back on him completely, and stepped into the plush leather interior of my vehicle. David firmly closed the heavy door behind me, instantly silencing the chaotic noise of the police radios and Jamal's pathetic weeping. I settled into the comfortable leather seat and pressed my finger against the polished control panel. The dark, heavily tinted window began to roll up with a smooth, silent, mechanical hum. Through the rising glass, I watched Jamal screaming my name, his hands clutching his head as the police officers aggressively grabbed his shoulders and dragged him away toward the squad car. The window sealed shut with a soft click. The flashing red and blue lights were completely muted by the dark tint. David put the car into drive, and we glided smoothly out of the neighborhood, leaving the entire fake dynasty burning in the rearview mirror. 6 months have passed since I rolled up that tinted window and drove away from the burning wreckage of the Watkins family. The bitter winter chill has faded into a bright and beautiful spring, and the heavy weight I carried during those 2 years of deception has been entirely lifted from my shoulders. The federal justice system moves remarkably fast when a powerful billionaire like Richard Montgomery makes a few strategic phone calls. He kept his absolute promise to the letter. By the time the sun came up the morning after that disastrous party, Jamal and Roland were permanently blacklisted from every single venture capital firm, banking institution, and private equity group in the financial district. Without any investor capital or hidden assets to rely on, Jamal could not afford a high-priced corporate defense attorney. He was assigned a notoriously overworked public defender. He is currently out on bail awaiting his federal trial for corporate espionage, wire fraud, and identity theft. Because the government placed a hard freeze on his financial profile, he was forced to take the only job that would hire an individual with multiple pending felony charges. The man who once wore expensive tailored suits and mocked my modest lifestyle now works the grueling overnight shift at a massive distribution warehouse on the industrial edge of the city. He wears a sweaty neon safety vest and steel-toed boots, spending 8 hours a night loading heavy cardboard boxes onto freight trucks for minimum wage. I heard through a mutual legal acquaintance that his hands are covered in thick blisters, and his arrogant charm has entirely vanished. He tried calling my office from a blocked number a few weeks after his arrest, desperately crying and begging for a second chance. My security team intercepted the call, and my attorney immediately filed a permanent restraining order. I have not heard his voice since. Kendra did not even make it to a trial. The overwhelming evidence on the digital audio recording, combined with the brutal internal audit conducted by her former corporate employer, forced her into a corner. She accepted a harsh plea deal to avoid a much longer sentence. She is currently serving 48 months in a federal correctional facility. There are no fake designer dresses, high-end cosmetics, or fancy networking events in federal prison. She is finally paying off her debts, but she is paying for them with years of her life instead of my flawless credit score. As for Beatrice and Roland, their fragile house of cards collapsed with spectacular, devastating speed. The bank officially foreclosed on the massive luxury estate less than a month after the party. The leased luxury vehicles were brutally repossessed right out of the circular driveway in broad daylight. All of their wealthy elite neighbors stood on their perfectly manicured lawns and watched the humiliating spectacle unfold. To pay for their mounting legal fees, Beatrice was forced to liquidate her entire wardrobe, discovering in the process that the pawn shops would only give her pennies for her counterfeit jewelry. Today, the former king and queen of high society live in a cramped, noisy one-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The walls are paper-thin, the plumbing constantly leaks, and the smell of cheap cooking oil permeates the hallways. Beatrice, the woman who used to loudly mock my tiny apartment and treat catering staff like garbage, now has to take the public city bus to purchase her groceries at a discount market. Their phones stopped ringing entirely. Their wealthy friends completely block their numbers and erase them from their social circles. They are entirely isolated, left alone to sit in their tiny living room and bitterly blame each other for their total financial and social ruin. I took a slow sip of my hot peppermint tea and leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair. I am currently sitting in my massive corner office on the top floor of the Apex Analytics headquarters. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows offer a breathtaking, unobstructed view of the entire city skyline. The morning sun reflects brilliantly off the surrounding skyscrapers, casting a warm, golden glow across my solid mahogany desk. My company recently closed the massive data migration contract with Richard Montgomery, expanding our corporate valuation by another $20 million. But the money is simply a byproduct of the profound peace I have secured for myself. My life is quiet, authentic, and completely mine. I do not have to shrink my intelligence to make insecure people feel comfortable. I do not have to wear a disguise or tolerate passive-aggressive insults just to keep the peace. I surgically removed the toxic infection from my life, and I am thriving in the clean space it left behind. I look down at the bustling city streets far below my window, feeling an overwhelming sense of deep, unshakable gratitude. They thought my silence meant I was weak. They thought my simplicity meant I was broke. They confused my kindness for stupidity and my patience for blind compliance. But real power does not need to shout. It does not need to wear flashy counterfeit jewelry or host lavish parties to prove it exists. Real power just waits for the perfect moment to execute. It moves quietly, observes everything, and strikes with absolute precision when the target finally exposes their true nature. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you thought you loved after seeing their true colors? Have you ever had to completely dismantle a toxic situation to protect your own future and your own dignity? Let me know in the comment section below. I read every single one of your stories, and I draw immense strength from your shared resilience. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe in the power of standing your ground against manipulative people. And remember, protect your peace, protect your energy, and always protect your credit score.